I thought the worst thing about Monday mornings was my commute to work, but I was wrong. The worst thing was standing in my office bathroom at 9:30 a.m., staring at legal documents that made my hands shake so violently I could barely hold the papers. The letterhead read, "Brennan and Associates Legal Services," and the subject line made my stomach drop. Property Transfer Agreement, Joanne Patricia Walsh versus Sarah Elizabeth Walsh Cooper. My own family had hired a lawyer to force me to give up my house. Not sell it, not negotiate about it, but literally hand over the keys to my 3-bedroom colonial home in exchange for my sister's cramped downtown apartment. The reason, according to the official legal language, was that childless adults should make reasonable sacrifices to ensure family members with dependent children have adequate living space. At the bottom of the document, in his familiar, scratchy handwriting, was my father's signature. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. I read the papers 3 more times, each word hitting me like a physical blow. My beautiful house with the wraparound porch and maple trees in the backyard, the house I had worked 60-hour weeks to afford, the house where I had planned to build my future, was being taken away because I chose not to have children. My sister Sarah, who had made completely different life choices, apparently deserved it more than I did. The legal document stated that my father, as co-signer on my original mortgage 10 years ago, had stakeholder rights that allowed him to initiate this property swap for the welfare of the family unit. I splashed cold water on my face and tried to process what I was reading. The law firm had conducted what they called a family needs assessment and determined that my house's yard space and additional bedrooms would better serve Sarah's twin toddlers than my single occupancy lifestyle. They had calculated square footage, evaluated neighborhood schools, and even assessed proximity to pediatric care facilities. This wasn't some spontaneous family discussion that got out of hand. This was a calculated, methodical plan to redistribute family property based on reproductive choices. The bathroom door creaked as someone entered, and I quickly folded the papers, shoving them into my purse. My coworker Rachel glanced at me with concern, probably noticing my red eyes and pale complexion. I mumbled something about allergies and escaped back to my cubicle, but I couldn't focus on spreadsheets or client calls. Every time I tried to concentrate on work, I kept seeing my father's signature on that document, kept imagining the family meetings that must have happened without me, the conversations where they decided my life was worth less than Sarah's, because I didn't have children running around my house. The phone rang, jolting me back to reality. It was my mother's number, and for a split second, I considered not answering. But maybe this was all some terrible misunderstanding. Maybe she was calling to tell me there had been a mistake, that the legal documents were sent to the wrong person, that my family would never actually try to steal my house. "Joanne, honey, I know you probably got some paperwork today." My mother's voice was artificially calm, the tone she used when she was trying to manage a situation she knew was explosive. "Your father and I would like you to come over for dinner tonight so we can discuss this as a family. Sarah and the children will be here too." My throat felt like sandpaper. "Mom, what is this? What are these legal papers?" "We can talk about everything tonight, sweetie. Just come over around 6 o'clock. We're having pot roast, your favorite." She hung up before I could ask any more questions, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. They were treating this like a normal family dinner invitation, as if they hadn't just served me with legal documents demanding I surrender my home. As if pot roast could somehow make me forget that my own parents had hired an attorney to force me out of the house I had spent a decade building into my sanctuary. I spent the rest of the workday in a fog, mechanically answering emails and attending meetings, while my mind raced through possibilities. Maybe this was some kind of intervention, a way to force a conversation about family responsibilities that had gotten out of hand. Maybe the lawyer had misrepresented what my parents wanted, or maybe there were details I didn't understand. But deep down in the pit of my stomach, I knew this was exactly what it appeared to be. My family believed I didn't deserve my house because I had chosen a different path than my sister. The drive to my parents' house that evening felt like driving to my own execution. Every familiar landmark, every street I had traveled thousands of times, seemed different now that I knew what was waiting for me. The house where I had grown up, where I had felt safe and loved, now felt like enemy territory. I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes watching the warm yellow light spilling from the kitchen windows, trying to gather the courage to walk into what I knew would be an ambush. The moment I stepped through my parents' front door, I knew this wasn't going to be a normal family dinner. Sarah was sitting in the living room with her 3-year-old twins, Emma and Ethan, but instead of the usual chaos of toys and sippy cups scattered everywhere, the scene looked staged. The children were quietly coloring at the coffee table while Sarah sat with perfect posture, wearing what I recognized as her serious conversation outfit, a navy blue dress that she reserved for parent-teacher conferences and doctor appointments. My mother emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands on her apron, but her usual warm greeting was replaced by a nervous smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Joanne, wonderful you're here. Why don't you come into the dining room? We have someone we'd like you to meet." My stomach clenched as I followed her through the doorway. Seated at our family dining table in the chair that had been mine throughout my childhood was a man in his 50s wearing a charcoal gray suit and wire-rimmed glasses. He stood up as I entered, extending his hand with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "Miss Walsh, I'm Harold Brennan from Brennan & Associates. I believe you received our correspondence regarding the property transfer proposal." I stared at his outstretched hand without taking it, my mind reeling. They had actually invited the lawyer to my parents' house. This wasn't a family discussion that had gotten legal advice. This was a coordinated attack planned and executed with military precision. My father appeared behind me, closing the dining room doors as if we were having some kind of board meeting. He looked older than I remembered, more fragile, and he wouldn't meet my eyes as he took his seat across from the lawyer. The formal place settings my mother had laid out suddenly made sense. This wasn't dinner. This was a negotiation where I was the only person who didn't know the terms. "Please sit down, Joanne," my mother said, gesturing to the only empty chair which happened to be directly across from Brennan. "Let's discuss this civilly." "Discuss what?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. "Stealing my house." Sarah's voice floated in from the living room carrying that martyred tone she had perfected over the years. "The children, Mom. Can we keep our voices down?" Brennan opened a leather folder and spread several documents across the table. I recognized the papers I had received that morning, but there were additional forms charts and what appeared to be property assessments. He had come prepared for war while I hadn't even known there was going to be a battle. "Miss Walsh, I understand the situation is emotionally challenging." Brennan began, his voice smooth and practiced. "But let's look at this from a practical perspective. Your current residence is a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom colonial home situated on approximately half an acre with a fenced backyard and proximity to Riverside Elementary School, which has an excellent rating for families with young children." He slid a photograph across the table. It was my house, but taken from an angle that emphasized the yard space and the swing set I had installed for when Sarah's kids visited. Seeing my home reduced to square footage calculations and school district ratings made me feel sick. Meanwhile, your sister's current residence is a 1-bedroom apartment in a building that doesn't allow children to play outside unsupervised. The twins are currently sharing not just a bedroom, but a single bed, which child development experts agree is detrimental to their growth and independence. Another photograph appeared, this one showing Sarah's cramped apartment with 2 toddler beds, squeezed into a space barely larger than my walk-in closet. I had been to Sarah's apartment dozens of times, and while it was small, it had never seemed like a crisis, requiring legal intervention. Furthermore, Brennan continued consulting another document. Your sister's building management has indicated that the noise complaints regarding children in a unit, not designated for families, may result in lease termination. The downtown apartment would be much more suitable for a single adult with no dependents, while providing your sister's family with the space and stability they need. My father finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Joanne, we're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to help the whole family." I turned to look at him. This man who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my math homework, who had co-signed my mortgage because he said he was proud of my independence and financial responsibility. "Dad, you signed legal papers to take my house away from me." "I signed papers to help my grandchildren," he said, but his voice shook with uncertainty. "Harold explained that since I co-signed your mortgage, I have the legal right to ensure the property serves the family's best interests." This was the moment I realized how deep the betrayal went. My father hadn't been tricked or pressured into signing those documents. He had been convinced that my life, my choices, my decade of hard work and sacrifice meant less than Sarah's need for more space. He had been convinced that being childless made me less deserving of the home I had earned. Brennan produced another document, this one thick, with legal terminology and official seals. "The family welfare clause in your original mortgage agreement gives your father as co-signer the authority to initiate property transfers when it serves the greater good of the family unit. This is particularly applicable when one family member has resources that exceed their practical needs, while other family members face housing insecurity." I stared at the papers, trying to remember signing anything that would give my father control over my property. When I was 25 and buying my first house, I had been so grateful for his co-signature that I probably would have signed anything. I had trusted him completely, never imagining that trust could be weaponized against me a decade later. "The proposed arrangement is fair and equitable," Brennan continued. "You would receive full ownership of a downtown apartment valued at approximately 85% of your current home's worth, while your sister would assume responsibility for your current mortgage payments, property taxes, and maintenance costs. From a financial perspective, you would actually benefit from reduced housing expenses and no yard maintenance responsibilities." Sarah appeared in the doorway, having apparently been listening to the entire conversation. She was holding Ethan on her hip while Emma clung to her leg, and she had clearly positioned herself this way, deliberately creating a visual reminder of why she supposedly needed my house more than I did. "Joanne, I know this is hard," she said, using her softest, most reasonable voice. "But Emma starts kindergarten next year, and Ethan needs space to run around safely. My apartment building doesn't even have a playground, and the nearest park is 6 blocks away with no safe place to cross the street." I looked at my sister, remembering all the times she had borrowed money she never repaid, all the times she had called me in tears about her latest crisis, all the times I had dropped everything to help her with the children, or her relationship problems, or her career struggles. Now she was standing in my parents' dining room with a lawyer demanding that I sacrifice my home to solve her housing problems. "Sarah, you chose to have children. You chose to live in that apartment. I chose to buy a house I could afford and work the hours necessary to maintain it. Why is your choice more important than mine?" The room went silent except for the sound of Emma starting to whimper. Sarah's expression shifted from pleading to cold determination, and I saw a glimpse of calculation that made me realize this conversation had been rehearsed. "Because children's needs come before adult wants," she said, adjusting her grip on Ethan. "Because family means sacrifice. Because some things are more important than personal convenience." Brennan cleared his throat, drawing attention back to his documents. "Miss Walsh, I should mention that your father's co-signature on the mortgage includes what's called a family welfare clause. This means that if you refuse to participate in this voluntary property exchange, he has the legal right to call in the loan, which would require you to pay the full remaining balance within 30 days or face foreclosure proceedings." The words hit me like a physical blow. I turned to stare at my father, waiting for him to contradict the lawyer to tell me this was all a misunderstanding. But he just sat there looking at his hands folded on the table. "Dad," I whispered. He finally looked up at me, and I saw guilt and determination warring in his expression. "Joanne, those children need a real home. You can make a fresh start in the city. It's better for everyone." I stood up so abruptly that my chair scraped against the hardwood floor. Better for everyone except me. As I headed toward the door, Brennan called after me. Miss Walsh, you have 2 weeks to consider the voluntary property exchange. After that, we'll have no choice but to pursue other legal options. I left my parents' house without saying goodbye, without eating the pot roast my mother had prepared, without hugging my niece and nephew like I normally would. As I sat in my car in their driveway, I could see them through the dining room window already deep in discussion about their next move. They had planned this ambush carefully complete with legal representation and emotional manipulation, and they honestly believed they were justified in taking my home away from me because I had made different life choices than my sister. The drive back to my house felt surreal. Every room, every piece of furniture, every carefully chosen paint color suddenly felt temporary. I walked through the space I had spent 10 years creating touching surfaces and wondering how many more times I would be able to call this place home. The swing set in the backyard that I had installed for Sarah's children now looked like evidence against me, proof that I had more space than I needed as a childless woman. But as I stood in my kitchen looking out at the garden I had planted and the bird feeder I filled every morning, something shifted inside me. This wasn't just about a house. This was about my right to exist as a complete person without children, my right to make choices about my own life, my right to be treated as an equal member of my family regardless of my reproductive decisions. If I let them take this from me, I would be agreeing that my life was worth less than Sarah's, that my decade of hard work meant nothing, that being childless made me a second-class citizen in my own family. I wasn't going to let that happen. The phone call started the next morning at 6:15 a.m. I was barely awake when my mother's ringtone jolted me from a restless sleep, filled with dreams about moving trucks and legal documents. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message while drinking my coffee in the kitchen that might not be mine much longer. "Joanne, honey, I know you're upset, but you need to think about what's best for the family. Those babies are living in conditions that just aren't suitable." Sarah showed me pictures of how cramped everything is, and Emma asked me yesterday why Aunt Joanne has such a big house when they have to sleep in the same room. How do you explain that to a 3-year-old? 3 more calls came before I left for work. My father's voice strained and formal, explaining that he had responsibilities as a grandfather and hoped I would come to my senses. Sarah crying, saying that Ethan had been asking why he couldn't have his own bedroom like other kids at daycare. Even my Aunt Patricia called, having apparently been briefed on the situation, suggesting that I think about what really matters in life. At work, I tried to focus on my quarterly reports, but concentration was impossible. Every time my phone buzzed, I wondered if it was another family member calling to guilt me into submission. By lunchtime, I had received 11 calls and 17 text messages, all variations on the same theme. I was being selfish. I was hurting children. I was destroying family harmony over just a house. The text from Sarah that arrived at 2 p.m. was particularly manipulative. "Emma drew you a picture at daycare today. It's our family standing in front of a big house with a swing set. She asked the teacher if all families live in houses like this, and the teacher said most do. I didn't know how to explain why we don't." I stared at my phone screen, feeling sick. They were using my 3-year-old niece as an emotional weapon, teaching her to see me as the reason her living situation wasn't perfect. Emma was too young to understand adult financial decisions or housing markets, but old enough to be coached into asking pointed questions designed to make me feel guilty. The calls intensified over the next few days. Extended family members I rarely spoke to suddenly had opinions about my housing situation. My cousin David called to tell me about his friend who had given up his house for his sister's family and how fulfilling it had been. My Uncle Robert shared a long story about sacrifice and family loyalty that sounded like it had been scripted. Even my elderly grandmother got involved, calling to remind me that family takes care of family and suggesting that I was being influenced by modern selfish thinking. But it wasn't just phone calls. Sarah had weaponized social media with surgical precision. Her Facebook posts had shifted from typical mom updates to carefully crafted narratives about their housing struggles. Photos of the twins crowded together in their small bedroom were accompanied by captions like, "Grateful for what we have, but dreaming of space for them to grow," and "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like if they could have their own room someday." The comments on her posts were even worse. Family, friends, and distant relatives who had no idea about the legal documents or property transfer demands were responding with sympathy and offers of help. Several people suggested she look into family assistance programs, not knowing that the family assistance she was seeking involved stealing my house. Then came the Facebook post that made my blood boil. Sarah had uploaded a photo of the twins playing in my backyard from their last visit with the caption, "They love having space to run around safely. Every child deserves this kind of environment to grow up healthy and happy, praying for a solution that puts their needs first." Within hours, the post had dozens of comments from people who didn't know the full story. "Those babies need that yard space," wrote one of Sarah's former co-workers. "I hope their family can help them find something better," added a woman from her church. "Children should always come first," declared someone I didn't even recognize. But the comment that shocked me most came from my own mother. "We're working on finding them a solution. Some people just need to remember what's truly important in life." My own mother was participating in Sarah's public manipulation campaign, making cryptic references to my selfishness without mentioning that they were trying to legally force me out of my home. To everyone reading these posts, I was the unnamed villain standing in the way of two innocent children having adequate housing. The pressure campaign reached a new level when my father showed up at my office on Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of a client presentation when my assistant knocked on the conference room door looking uncomfortable. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a family emergency. Your father is in the lobby and says he needs to speak with you immediately." My heart stopped. Family emergency could mean anything, and despite everything that was happening, I still loved my family. I excused myself from the meeting and hurried downstairs only to find my father sitting calmly in the lobby chairs, no emergency in sight. "Dad, what's wrong? What happened?" He stood up slowly, looking older and more frail than I remembered. "Nothing's wrong, Joanne. I just needed to talk to you somewhere neutral away from all the family drama." I was furious. "You told my assistant there was a family emergency. I left a client meeting." "There is an emergency," he said quietly. "My grandbabies are living in conditions that aren't suitable, and my daughter is too stubborn to help them." We found an empty conference room where he proceeded to show me more photographs of Sarah's apartment, as if I hadn't been there dozens of times myself. He had pictures of the twins' cramped bedroom, the tiny living space, the lack of outdoor play area. He also had drawings that Emma and Ethan had apparently made of their dream house, which looked suspiciously like my house, complete with the distinctive wraparound porch and maple trees. "They drew these without any prompting," he said, spreading the pictures across the conference table. "Emma told Sarah she wants a house like Aunt Joanne's so she can have tea parties on the porch." The manipulation was so obvious, it was insulting. 3-year-olds don't independently draw detailed house plans, complete with specific architectural features, unless someone has guided their artistic vision. But my father seemed to genuinely believe these pictures represented spontaneous expressions of his grandchildren's housing dreams. "Dad, do you realize what you're asking me to do? You're asking me to give up everything I've worked for because Sarah made different choices than I did." His face hardened. "I'm asking you to help your family. I'm asking you to think about someone other than yourself for once." That phrase, "think about someone other than yourself," had become the family refrain. Every conversation, every phone call, every guilt trip came back to my supposed selfishness. But nobody was asking Sarah to think about someone other than herself. Nobody was suggesting she make sacrifices to solve her housing problems. Nobody was questioning whether demanding her sister's house was selfish. "What about me, Dad? What about my life, my work, my future plans?" He waved his hand dismissively. "You can make new plans. You're young, you're single, you have no responsibilities. Sarah has children depending on her." The casual dismissal of my entire adult life as no responsibilities cut deeper than I expected. I wasn't married, didn't have children, so apparently my decade of building a career, maintaining a home, contributing to my community, taking care of my aging parents, counted for nothing. In his mind, I was still just a placeholder waiting for real life to begin, while Sarah's life was already real and important because she had reproduced. As my father gathered up his photographs and drawings, he delivered what was clearly meant to be the final blow. Harold says, if you don't agree to the property exchange by next Friday, we'll have to move forward with calling in the mortgage. I don't want to do that to you, Joanne, but those children come first. He left me sitting alone in that conference room, staring at the pictures of my niece and nephew's artwork, feeling like I was drowning in family guilt and manipulation. When I returned to my own meeting, I had to apologize for the interruption and try to regain focus on quarterly projections while my personal life was being systematically destroyed. That evening, I found a handwritten letter slipped under my front door. It was from Sarah, 3 pages of careful script explaining her situation and asking me to be the bigger person. She wrote about her fears for the children's development, her anxiety about their safety in the current apartment, her dreams of giving them the stable childhood we had enjoyed in our parents' house. But mixed in with the emotional appeals were subtle threats. She mentioned that their current lease was up for renewal in 2 months, and she wasn't sure they could afford the increase. She noted that Ethan had been having behavioral problems that the pediatrician attributed to lack of space and overstimulation. She even suggested that my refusal to help was causing stress that was affecting her milk production while nursing. The letter ended with a paragraph that revealed the true depth of the family conspiracy. Mom and Dad have been so worried about this situation that Dad's blood pressure has been acting up again. Dr. Martinez had to adjust his medication last week. I know you don't want to be responsible for making Daddy sick over something that could be solved so easily. Now they were suggesting that my resistance to their property theft was endangering my father's health. The manipulation had evolved from guilt about the children to emotional blackmail about family medical emergencies. They had transformed a simple housing preference into a life or death situation, where I was apparently the villain threatening everyone's well-being. I sat on my porch that night looking out at the yard where my niece and nephew played during family gatherings, wondering how everything had gotten so twisted. These were people who claimed to love me, who had raised me to work hard and be independent, who had once been proud of my achievements. Now they saw those achievements as excess that should be redistributed to family members, whose choices had left them with less. The worst part was starting to doubt myself. With so many people telling me I was wrong, selfish and cruel part of me wondered if they were right. Maybe childless adults should sacrifice for families with children. Maybe my attachment to my house was shallow and materialistic. Maybe I was being unreasonable about something that was just property. But then I walked through my house, touching the walls. I had painted the floors. I had refinished the garden I had planted from scratch. And I remembered that this wasn't just property. This was 10 years of my life, my dreams, my vision of the future I wanted to build. This was the physical representation of my independence and hard work. Giving it up wouldn't just change my address. It would change who I was, what I believed about my own worth, and what I accepted as my place in the family hierarchy. I wasn't going to let them redefine my value based on my reproductive choices. I wasn't going to accept that my life mattered less than Sarah's because she had children and I didn't. And I definitely wasn't going to reward this coordinated campaign of manipulation and guilt by giving them exactly what they wanted. But I also realized I couldn't fight this battle alone. They had lawyers, family support, and a carefully orchestrated pressure campaign designed to wear down my resistance. If I was going to protect my home and my rights, I needed help from someone who understood both the legal and emotional weapons being used against me. It was time to find my own lawyer. Finding a lawyer turned out to be more difficult than I expected. My first call to Johnson & Associates seemed promising until the receptionist asked for more details about my case. When I mentioned Harold Brennan and family property disputes, there was a long pause before she informed me that their firm had a conflict of interest and couldn't represent me. The second law firm, Martinez Legal Services, had a similar response. The paralegal who took my call seemed sympathetic until I provided specifics about the property transfer demand and my family's involvement. She put me on hold for several minutes before returning to explain that they had prior obligations that prevented them from taking my case. By the time the third firm, Davidson and Partners, gave me the same runaround, I realized this wasn't coincidence. Brennan had been thorough in his preparation, creating conflicts of interest with local attorneys before I even knew I needed legal representation. The manipulation ran deeper than family guilt trips and social media campaigns. He had systematically eliminated my access to legal help in my own community. That's when Brennan himself called me directly. "Miss Walsh, I understand you've been making inquiries about independent legal representation." His voice was smooth and confident with an undertone that made my skin crawl. "I wanted to reach out personally to discuss your options and perhaps clear up some misunderstandings about your situation." "What misunderstandings?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Well, for instance, many people don't realize that family welfare clauses in mortgage agreements are quite standard and legally binding. Your father's rights as co-signer aren't just ceremonial. He has legitimate authority to make decisions that serve the family's best interests, especially when it comes to ensuring adequate housing for minor children." I was sitting in my kitchen looking out at the garden I had spent years cultivating, while this stranger explained how my own mortgage could be used against me. "Mr. Brennan, I never agreed to any family welfare clause. I would remember signing something that gave my father control over my property." His chuckle was condescending. "Miss Walsh, you were 25 when you signed those documents. Young adults often don't fully understand the implications of complex financial agreements, especially when they're focused on achieving their immediate goal of home ownership. The clause was explained to your father as the co-signer since he was assuming the primary financial risk." "Primary financial risk? I've been making every payment for 10 years. "Of course, but co-signers remain liable for the full loan amount in case of default. Your father has a vested interest in ensuring the property maintains its value and serves its highest and best use. A family home should serve a family's needs. Wouldn't you agree?" The way he twisted language made my head spin. Somehow my decade of perfect payment history was irrelevant, while my father's signature on a piece of paper gave him authority over my life choices. According to Brennan's logic, buying a house as a single woman had been presumptuous, and my family was simply correcting that oversight. "I'd like to review my original mortgage documents," I said. "Certainly, though I should mention that several local law firms have declined to represent you due to potential conflicts of interest. This is actually quite common in family property matters, since many attorneys prefer to avoid cases that could damage long-standing relationships with other clients." Translation: he had made sure I couldn't get legal help locally, but his next words revealed the true scope of his manipulation. "However, I'd be happy to recommend some attorneys in neighboring counties who could review your documents and explain your limited options. Of course, hiring out-of-town representation would be significantly more expensive than resolving this matter through family cooperation." Even his offer to help was a trap designed to drain my resources while reinforcing his narrative that resistance was futile. But his confidence also revealed something important. If he was working this hard to prevent me from getting independent legal advice, then my case might not be as hopeless as he wanted me to believe. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Brennan, but I'll find my own representation." "Miss Walsh, may I speak frankly? Your family loves you. They're not trying to harm you. They're simply trying to solve a housing crisis that affects 2 innocent children. The longer you delay making a reasonable decision, the more expensive and complicated this situation becomes for everyone involved." After he hung up, I sat staring at my phone, feeling like I was trapped in a legal maze designed by people who knew the system far better than I did. But Brennan had made one mistake in his smooth sales pitch. He had confirmed that my original mortgage documents were the key to understanding my rights. I spent the evening searching through my file cabinet looking for the thick folder of papers I had signed 10 years ago when buying my house. Most of it was standard mortgage language that I barely understood then, and certainly couldn't interpret now. But buried in the middle of the stack, I found a single page that made my blood run cold. It was titled Co-Signer Agreement and Family Welfare Provisions. And it was definitely not something I remembered seeing during the original closing. The language was dense legal terminology, but certain phrases jumped out: transfer of beneficial use, family housing optimization, and co-signer authority in cases of changing family circumstances. I read the document 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. This wasn't part of my original mortgage agreement. The paper was newer, printed on slightly different letterhead, and attached to the rest of the documents with a paperclip rather than the staples that held everything else together. Someone had added this page to my mortgage file after the fact. My hands were shaking as I called the bank that held my mortgage. The customer service representative who answered was polite, but not particularly helpful. "Ma'am, I can see your account information, but I'm not able to access detailed document history without a formal request. If you suspect there are discrepancies in your mortgage paperwork, you'd need to submit a written inquiry through our dispute resolution department." How long would that take? Typically 6 to 8 weeks for a complete document review, assuming there are no complications. 6 to 8 weeks. Brennan had given me 2 weeks to agree to the property transfer, knowing that I couldn't possibly get answers about my mortgage documents in time to make an informed decision. Every aspect of this situation had been carefully timed to eliminate my options and force my compliance. But as I studied the suspicious document more carefully, I noticed something interesting. The signature line for my name was blank. This family welfare clause that supposedly gave my father authority over my property had never been signed by me. If it had been added to my mortgage file without my knowledge or consent, then it might not be legally valid. That realization gave me the first spark of hope I had felt since this nightmare began. Brennan's confidence might be based on fraudulent documents. The family welfare clause that was supposedly ironclad might be worth less than the paper it was printed on. And if the legal foundation of their property grab was fake, then everything else they were threatening might be equally hollow. I needed to find a lawyer who could recognize document fraud and wasn't afraid to challenge Harold Brennan's reputation in the legal community. Someone outside his sphere of influence who wouldn't be intimidated by potential conflicts of interest or worried about maintaining collegial relationships with someone who might be a criminal. The next morning, I called the State Bar Association's referral service and explained that I needed an attorney who specialized in mortgage fraud and document tampering. They gave me 3 names, all in the state capital, about 2 hours away. The first attorney's office said they were booked for 3 months. The second never returned my call. The third name on the list was Grace Martinez from Martinez Legal Defense. When I called her office, I half expected another runaround about conflicts of interest or scheduling problems. Instead, the receptionist put me directly through to Grace herself. "Miss Walsh, I understand you're dealing with some questionable family property transfer demands. Can you tell me more about the documents you've received?" I explained the entire situation from the legal papers demanding property exchange to my father's co-signer authority to the suspicious mortgage clause I had discovered. Grace listened without interrupting, asking pointed questions about timing, document authenticity, and Brennan's involvement with other local attorneys. "Miss Walsh, what you're describing sounds like a pattern I've seen before. Family property manipulation cases often involve document alteration, manufactured legal authority, and systematic elimination of the victim's access to independent counsel. Can you bring your mortgage papers to my office tomorrow afternoon? I'd like to examine them in person." For the first time in days, I felt like someone was taking my situation seriously. Grace didn't dismiss my concerns or suggest that I should cooperate with my family's demands. She recognized the legal manipulation for what it was and seemed confident that it could be challenged. "One more question," she said before we hung up. "Has anyone in your family suggested that this property transfer is necessary to prevent foreclosure or other immediate financial consequences?" "Yes, Brennan said my father could call in the mortgage if I don't cooperate." Grace's laugh was sharp and knowing. Miss Walsh co-signers don't have the authority to call in mortgages. They're liable for payments if the primary borrower defaults, but they can't unilaterally demand full payment of a performing loan. Someone has been lying to you about basic mortgage law. As I hung up the phone, I realized that everything I had been told about my legal situation might be fabricated. The family welfare clause, my father's supposed authority, Brennan's threats about foreclosure, even the urgency of the 2-week deadline might all be part of an elaborate fraud designed to steal my house through intimidation and manufactured legal pressure. If Grace was right, then my family hadn't just hired a lawyer to help with a property dispute. They had hired someone who specialized in family property theft, someone who used document fraud and legal manipulation to force compliance from targets who didn't know their rights. The question was whether they knew they were working with a criminal or whether they had been manipulated just as thoroughly as I had. I woke up Saturday morning to the sound of car doors slamming in my driveway. Through my bedroom window, I could see Sarah's minivan parked behind my car, effectively blocking me in. She was unloading suitcases and cardboard boxes, while Emma and Ethan ran around my front yard like they owned the place. By the time I got downstairs and opened my front door, Sarah had already carried 2 large suitcases onto my porch. She was wearing the determined expression I remembered from our childhood, the look that meant she had made a decision and wouldn't be talked out of it regardless of how unreasonable it was. "Sarah, what are you doing?" She straightened up from where she had been setting down a box of what appeared to be children's toys. "We're moving in temporarily just until the property transfer is finalized. It doesn't make sense for us to keep paying rent on the apartment when we're going to be living here anyway." I stared at her in disbelief. "You can't just move into my house without permission." "Joanne, be reasonable. The children need to start getting used to their new home, and I need to begin the transition process gradually, so it's not traumatic for them." She was using her patient maternal voice, the one that implied I was being childish for not understanding obvious adult logic. Emma came running up the porch steps, throwing her arms around my legs in a hug that would have been adorable under any other circumstances. "Aunt Joanne, Mommy says we're going to live in your house now. Can I see my new room?" My heart broke a little. Emma had no idea she was being used as an emotional weapon in an adult property dispute. To her, this was an exciting adventure, moving to the big house with the swing set and the pretty garden. But Sarah had clearly been preparing her for this moment, teaching her to think of my house as her new home before any legal agreements had been signed. "Sweetie, you're just visiting today. You live with Mommy in your apartment." Emma's face scrunched up in confusion. "But Mommy said we're going to live here because our apartment is too small and you have extra rooms you don't need." Sarah shot me a look that was half apologetic, half defiant. "I've been preparing them for the transition gradually. Child development experts recommend that major changes happen slowly to avoid psychological trauma." Ethan had found his way to the backyard, and I could hear him shouting with delight as he discovered the sandbox I had built for their previous visits. Through the kitchen window, I watched him running in circles, arms outstretched, like an airplane completely oblivious to the adult drama surrounding his housing situation. "Sarah, you can't move in here. We don't have any agreement, legal or otherwise, about property transfer." She was already carrying another box toward my front door, this one labeled kitchen items, in her neat handwriting. Dad and Harold both think a transition period is the best approach. It gives you time to get used to the idea while the children start feeling settled. Plus, it's easier for me to handle the logistics of moving if I can do it gradually instead of all at once. The casual way she mentioned Dad and Harold revealed that this invasion had been planned and approved by both my father and the lawyer. They weren't just demanding my house, they were implementing an occupation strategy designed to make my resistance more difficult. "Where are you supposed to be living while you're transitioning here?" Sarah's hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "Well, I gave notice on the apartment lease. The landlord was pressuring me to renew or vacate by the end of the month anyway, so I figured it was better to save the money and focus on getting the children settled in their permanent home." She had burned her bridges. Sarah had given up her apartment assuming I would capitulate to the family pressure rather than let my niece and nephew become homeless. It was the ultimate manipulation, using her children's housing security as leverage to force my compliance. Sarah, what if the property transfer doesn't happen? What if I refuse to sign? For the first time, her confident facade cracked. Joanne, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't make your niece and nephew homeless over a house. You're not that selfish. There it was again. The suggestion that protecting my own property rights was selfish while demanding someone else's house was somehow virtuous. But now the stakes were higher because Sarah had created a genuine housing crisis for her children by giving up their apartment based on the assumption that my house was already theirs. Emma reappeared in the kitchen, having apparently been exploring the house during our conversation. "Aunt Joanne, which room is going to be mine? Mommy said I might get my own room like a big girl." I knelt down to Emma's eye level, trying to figure out how to explain an impossible situation to a 3-year-old. "Emma, honey, this is Aunt Joanne's house. You have your own home with Mommy." "But Mommy said our old home was too small and we needed a bigger one. She said you have extra space because you don't have any children to fill up the rooms." Emma's innocent repetition of Sarah's talking points was heartbreaking. She was too young to understand the manipulation, but old enough to have internalized the message that childless adults had extra space that should be redistributed to families. Sarah appeared behind Emma, placing protective hands on her daughter's shoulders. "Joanne, look at her face. Look at how happy she is here. How can you even think about taking this away from her?" The emotional blackmail was suffocating. Sarah had engineered a situation where any decision I made would hurt innocent children. If I let them stay, I would be enabling the theft of my house. If I made them leave, I would be forcing my niece and nephew into homelessness. There was no choice that didn't make me look like a villain. But as I watched Emma exploring my kitchen and Ethan playing in my backyard, I realized something important. This wasn't my fault. I hadn't created this crisis. Sarah had chosen to give up her apartment without securing alternative housing. My family had chosen to pursue a property theft scheme instead of helping Sarah find legitimate solutions to her housing needs. They had created this situation specifically to force my hand, and now they were trying to make me responsible for fixing problems they had manufactured. "Sarah, you need to find somewhere else to stay. You can't move into my house without my permission." Her face hardened. "Fine. I'll call Dad and Mom. Maybe they can explain to you what family loyalty means." She pulled out her phone and dialed while Emma and Ethan continued exploring the house as if they already lived there. Within minutes, both my parents' cars were pulling into my driveway. They had been waiting nearby, ready to reinforce Sarah's occupation of my home with their physical presence and emotional pressure. My mother was the first one through the door, carrying a casserole dish and wearing the martyred expression she reserved for family crises. "Joanne, what is this about Sarah called us crying, saying you're trying to make the children homeless?" My father followed behind her, looking grim and disappointed. He was carrying what appeared to be more of the children's belongings, as if he had been helping with the move before Sarah called for reinforcements. "Dad, did you know Sarah was moving into my house today?" He set down the boxes and looked at me with the same expression he had used when I was a teenager caught breaking curfew. "Joanne, this isn't just your house anymore. The legal paperwork has been filed. Harold says the transition period is the most reasonable approach for everyone involved. The legal paperwork for what I haven't signed anything agreeing to a property transfer." My mother started bustling around my kitchen as if she lived there, unpacking the casserole and looking for serving dishes. "Honey, you don't need to sign anything. Your father has the authority to make decisions about the mortgage, and Harold has explained everything to us. This house is going to serve its proper purpose as a family home instead of sitting here mostly empty." The phrase "mostly empty" was particularly infuriating. My house wasn't empty. It was home to me. Every room had a purpose. Every space reflected my choices and personality. But in their minds, a house occupied by a single person was wasteful, regardless of who owned it or who paid the mortgage. Emma had found her way to the living room and was examining my bookshelf with the serious concentration of a child who was cataloging her new possessions. "Aunt Joanne, do you have any books for kids?" Mommy said. "When we live here, you could read me bedtime stories in my new room." Sarah had been telling the children that I would continue to live in the house after they moved in, as if I would become a live-in babysitter in my own home. The assumption was that I would not only give up ownership of my property, but also provide free childcare and maintain the house for Sarah's benefit. "Sarah, exactly what arrangement did you think we were going to have here?" She looked surprised by the question. "Well, obviously, you'll move to the downtown apartment eventually, but there's no rush. You could stay here for a while during the transition, help the children get settled. Maybe watch them after school since you don't have the same family obligations I do." The casual way she described my future role as an unpaid nanny in my own former house was breathtaking. In Sarah's vision, I would not only surrender my property, but also my independence, becoming a support system for her family's convenience. My father cleared his throat, drawing attention to himself. "Joanne Harold wants to meet with all of us on Monday morning to finalize the details. He says if we can get this resolved quickly, it'll be much easier on everyone, especially the children. And if I refuse to meet with Harold..." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threats. Finally, my father spoke in the careful tone he used for delivering ultimatums. "Then he'll have no choice but to pursue foreclosure proceedings based on the Family Welfare Clause violations. Joanne, I don't want to see you lose everything, but I won't let my grandchildren suffer because you're being stubborn about material possessions." As I looked around my kitchen filled with my family members who were casually discussing the theft of my home, while my niece and nephew played with their toys in my living room, I realized that Monday's meeting wasn't going to be a negotiation. It was going to be a formality where I would be presented with documents to sign, surrounded by family pressure and emotional manipulation, while my own home was already being occupied by the people who intended to take it from me. But they had made one crucial mistake in their escalation strategy by forcing this confrontation. They had eliminated any possibility of voluntary cooperation. I had spent days wondering if maybe they were right, if maybe I should sacrifice for my family's needs. But watching them methodically dismantle my autonomy while using my love for Emma and Ethan as a weapon had clarified my thinking completely. I wasn't going to reward this manipulation by giving them what they wanted. I wasn't going to teach my niece and nephew that taking other people's property was acceptable if you really wanted it. And I definitely wasn't going to let Harold Brennan profit from what was looking more and more like an elaborate fraud scheme. Monday's meeting was going to be very different from what they expected. Sunday night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of Emma and Ethan's voices echoing through my house, the sight of Sarah's belongings scattered across my living room, the casual way my family had invaded my sanctuary kept replaying in my mind. Around 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and decided to do something productive with my insomnia. I started going through every piece of paperwork related to the property transfer demand, looking for details I might have missed. Hidden in the back of Harold Brennan's folder was a document I hadn't noticed before, a property assessment report dated 3 weeks ago. Someone had been evaluating my house's market value well before they presented me with any legal paperwork. But what caught my attention wasn't the assessment itself, it was the address listed for comparison properties. One of them was Sarah's apartment building, listed as conversion candidate for condominium development. The report noted that current renters would face substantial buy-in requirements or mandatory relocation within 6 months. My stomach dropped. Sarah hadn't mentioned anything about condominium conversion. According to this document, she wasn't just facing cramped living conditions, she was facing eviction unless she could afford to buy her apartment at market rate. The family's sudden urgency about housing made a lot more sense when viewed as a financial emergency rather than a children's welfare issue. I spent the next 3 hours researching condominium conversions online, learning about tenant rights and notification requirements. In our state, landlords had to provide 90 days' notice before beginning conversion proceedings. If Sarah's building was starting that process, she would have known about the timeline well before my family ambushed me with property transfer demands. At 6 a.m., I drove to Sarah's apartment building to see what I could learn. The lobby bulletin board told me everything I needed to know, posted notices about upcoming ownership transition opportunities and resident purchase options with deadlines that matched the timeline of my family's legal pressure campaign. Sarah had known for months that she would need to either buy her apartment or find new housing. Instead of telling the family about her financial crisis, she had worked with my parents and Harold Brennan to solve her problem by taking my house. The touching story about children needing more space was a cover for a much more urgent economic reality. But why hadn't they just asked for help? Why the elaborate legal manipulation, instead of a straightforward family conversation about Sarah's housing crisis? I drove to my parents' house to get answers arriving, just as my father was leaving for his morning walk. "Dad, we need to talk. I know about the condominium conversion." His face went pale. "Joanne, what are you doing here so early?" "I'm trying to understand why my own family chose lies and manipulation instead of honesty about Sarah's situation." He looked older than his 73 years as he invited me inside. My mother was in the kitchen making coffee, and she nearly dropped the pot when she saw me. "Joanne, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be getting ready for work?" "I'm taking a personal day. We need to discuss Sarah's real housing situation." The look that passed between my parents confirmed that they knew more than they had admitted. My mother sat down heavily at the kitchen table, suddenly looking as exhausted as I felt. "Your sister didn't want you to know about the financial problems," she said quietly. She was embarrassed about not being able to afford the apartment purchase option. "How much does she need?" My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The buy-in option is $85,000, plus monthly association fees that are twice what she's currently paying in rent." The numbers made Sarah's desperation clear, but they also revealed something else. My house was worth approximately $240,000, meaning the property swap would give Sarah's family about $150,000 in equity beyond what they needed to solve their housing crisis. "Dad, if Sarah needs $85,000, why are you trying to give her a house worth $240,000? The uncomfortable silence told me I had identified the real issue. This wasn't about helping Sarah avoid eviction. This was about transferring substantial family wealth from me to her under the guise of solving a housing emergency. "Joanne R., my mother said carefully, Sarah's family has expenses you don't understand. Childcare, medical bills, college savings. The house would provide them with financial security for the future." "What about my financial security?" My father's expression hardened. "You don't have children to provide for. You don't need the same level of financial cushioning." There it was, the underlying belief that had driven this entire scheme. My parents genuinely believed that my financial security mattered less than Sarah's because I had chosen not to have children. In their minds, my decade of mortgage payments and property improvements were just temporary stewardship until the house could be transferred to the family member who deserved it more. "Dad, do you realize what you're asking me to sacrifice? Not just the house, but my financial future, my retirement planning, everything I've built." He waved his hand dismissively. "You're young. You can rebuild. Sarah has children who need stability now." But as I pressed for more details about Sarah's finances, a more complicated picture emerged. The apartment building conversion wasn't the only financial pressure she was facing. She had credit card debt, student loans from her recent nursing degree program, and a car payment that was higher than my mortgage payment. The house transfer wasn't just about housing, it was about solving multiple financial problems by giving Sarah substantial assets she hadn't earned. Why didn't anyone tell me the truth from the beginning? My mother looked guilty. "Harold said it would be easier if you believed this was about the children's welfare rather than money. He said people are more willing to help family when it's presented as protecting kids instead of financial assistance." Harold Brennan had advised my family to lie to me. He had crafted the children need space narrative specifically to manipulate my emotions, while concealing the financial motivations behind the property transfer demand. The legal documents, the guilt campaigns, the social media manipulation, all of it was designed to hide the fact that my family wanted to give Sarah over $100,000 of my money. How much are you paying Harold for his services? Another uncomfortable silence. Finally, my father answered. His fee is contingent on successful property transfer. He gets 5% of the equity difference. I did the math quickly. Brennan stood to make over $7,000 from my family's property theft scheme, which explained his aggressive tactics and willingness to potentially commit fraud. He wasn't just a lawyer providing family mediation services. He was a professional property manipulator with significant financial incentive to force my compliance. But there was still something that didn't add up. 5% of the equity difference was a substantial fee, but not enough to explain Brennan's systematic elimination of my access to local legal representation. That level of coordination suggested experience with similar schemes. How did you find Harold, who recommended him to you? My parents exchanged another look. Actually, my mother said reluctantly, he contacted us. Someone at Sarah's apartment building told her about families who had used his services to resolve property distribution issues. The pieces clicked into place. Brennan hadn't been hired by my family, he had targeted them. He specialized in identifying families facing housing crises and offering property redistribution services that benefited him financially while destroying relationships between family members. My parents and Sarah weren't criminal masterminds. They were victims of a predatory lawyer who had convinced them that stealing my house was legal and ethical. I left my parents' house with a completely different understanding of the situation. Yes, my family had betrayed me and chosen manipulation over honesty, but they had been guided by a professional who specialized in family property fraud, someone who knew exactly how to exploit family dynamics and financial pressures to generate income for himself. The question was whether I could prove that Brennan had committed fraud and whether my family would cooperate with exposing his schemes once they understood they had been manipulated as thoroughly as I had. I drove straight to Grace Martinez's office, arriving an hour before my scheduled appointment. Her receptionist let me wait in the conference room where I spread out all the documents I had discovered and tried to organize the evidence of what was looking like a sophisticated fraud operation. When Grace arrived, she took one look at my documentation and smiled grimly. "Miss Walsh, I think we've found our smoking gun. But first I need to show you something that's going to make you very angry." She opened her laptop and pulled up a website for Brennan and Associates. The homepage featured testimonials from satisfied clients who had used his services to optimize family property distribution and ensure fair housing allocation among relatives. One testimonial was particularly telling. Harold helped us convince my sister to share her inheritance more equitably. She was initially resistant, but his legal expertise showed her that cooperation was in everyone's best interest. "Miss Walsh, your family isn't the first, and they won't be the last. Harold Brennan has built his practice on manipulating families into property transfers that benefit him financially, while destroying relationships permanently. The good news is that his methods are so consistent, they're relatively easy to prosecute once we have enough evidence." Grace pulled out a thick file folder. "I've been tracking Brennan's activities for 2 years, ever since he targeted my own cousin's family. What he's doing to you is part of a pattern that involves document fraud, elder manipulation, and systematic elimination of victims' access to legal representation." As Grace showed me case files from 3 other families who had been targeted by Brennan's schemes, I realized my situation was both worse and better than I had thought. Worse because this was a professional operation that had successfully stolen property from other families. Better because Grace had been building a case against Brennan that my situation could help complete. The challenge, Grace explained, is that families usually don't report these schemes because they're embarrassed about being manipulated by relatives. The victims end up isolated from family support systems and reluctant to pursue criminal charges against people they still love despite being betrayed. But my case was different because I had discovered the fraud before signing any property transfer documents. If we moved quickly, we could not only protect my house, but also expose Brennan's operations in a way that might help other families avoid similar schemes. Miss Walsh, are you prepared for your family to face criminal charges if we can prove they participated in fraud? I thought about Emma and Ethan playing in my backyard, believing they were moving into their new home. I thought about my parents who had somehow convinced themselves that stealing their daughter's house was an act of love. I thought about Sarah facing genuine financial crisis, but choosing manipulation over honest conversation. Grace, I want my family to understand what they've done. I want them to face consequences that make them think twice about targeting other people's property. But mostly, I want to make sure Harold Brennan can't do this to another family. She smiled, and I saw the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time for the right case to bring down a predator. Miss Walsh, I think we can accomplish all of those goals. But first we need to catch him in the act of fraud, and that means you're going to have to attend tomorrow's meeting. As Grace explained her plan, I realized that Monday's confrontation with my family was about to become much more complicated than anyone expected. Monday morning started with my supervisor, Janet Richardson, calling me into her office before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. She was sitting behind her desk with the uncomfortable expression she wore when delivering bad news, and there was a manila folder on her desk that immediately made me nervous. "Joanne, please close the door and have a seat. We need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding your recent personal situation." My heart sank. I had been dreading this conversation since Sarah started her social media campaign, but I hadn't expected my family's manipulation to reach my workplace so quickly. "Janet, if this is about the time I've taken off recently, I can explain." She held up her hand to stop me. "This isn't about your time off. I received several phone calls over the weekend from someone identifying themselves as your sister, expressing concerns about your emotional stability and decision-making capacity." The words hit me like a physical blow. Sarah had called my workplace to sabotage my professional reputation. She had crossed the line from family manipulation into active destruction of my career. What exactly did she say? Janet opened the folder and consulted what appeared to be notes from phone conversations. "According to your sister, you're experiencing a family crisis involving housing disputes that has caused significant emotional distress. She suggested that the stress might be affecting your judgment and asked whether we had noticed any changes in your work performance." My face burned with humiliation. Sarah had painted me as emotionally unstable to my employer, creating professional consequences for my resistance to her property theft scheme. But Janet wasn't finished. She also mentioned that you've been making irrational financial decisions, something about refusing reasonable family assistance that would benefit children. She seemed very concerned about your mental health and suggested that family leave might be appropriate while you work through these issues. The sophisticated manipulation was breathtaking. Sarah had called my employer pretending to be a concerned sister, worried about my well-being while actually sabotaging my professional standing to increase pressure for me to comply with her demands. By suggesting I might need family leave, she was threatening my job security just as my father was threatening my housing security. Janet, did she mention that the family assistance she's referring to involves her demanding that I give her my house? Janet's eyebrows shot up. No, she didn't mention anything like that. She spoke about family support systems and shared housing arrangements, but she made it sound like you were refusing help that was being offered to you. She's trying to take my house through legal manipulation, and when I refused to cooperate, she decided to attack my career. I spent the next 20 minutes explaining the entire situation to Janet, showing her the legal documents Brennan had sent and the fraudulent mortgage clauses Grace had identified. Janet listened with growing concern, taking notes and asking detailed questions about the timeline of events. "Joanne, I'm so sorry this is happening to you, but I need you to understand the position this puts me in. If family members are calling to express concerns about an employee's stability, I'm required to document those calls and assess whether workplace performance might be affected." The corporate liability implications were clear. Even though Sarah's calls were malicious manipulation, they created a paper trail that could expose the company to risk if I had workplace problems later. Janet was trapped between supporting an employee and protecting the organization. What does this mean for my job? For now, nothing changes. Your work performance has been excellent and you've shown no signs of the instability your sister described. But Joanne, if she continues calling, or if other family members start contacting us with similar concerns, we might need to consider requiring documentation from a mental health professional confirming your fitness for work. The threat was politely delivered but unmistakably clear. My family's manipulation campaign could force me to undergo psychological evaluation to keep my job. They had weaponized workplace liability policies against me, creating professional consequences for refusing to surrender my house. As I returned to my cubicle, I noticed several co-workers looking at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to sympathy. Word had spread quickly that I was dealing with family issues, and I could practically feel the office gossip machine speculating about what kind of personal crisis required intervention from supervisors. My phone rang and Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to a message that made me physically sick. Joanne, I hope you understand that I called your office out of genuine concern for your well-being. The stress of this housing situation is clearly affecting your judgment, and I thought your employer should know in case you need professional support or time off to get the help you need. I love you and I want what's best for you, even if you can't see that right now. She had created a narrative where my resistance to property theft was evidence of mental illness requiring professional intervention. By positioning herself as the concerned family member, trying to help someone who was too unwell to accept assistance, she had turned my employer into an unwitting ally in her pressure campaign. But Sarah wasn't finished. Around lunchtime, my desk phone rang with a call from the company's Employee Assistance Program coordinator. Ms. Walsh, this is Jennifer from EAP. I understand you might be dealing with some family stressors that could benefit from counseling support. Your sister called to express concern and suggested that you might need someone to talk to about housing and family relationship issues. Sarah had systematically contacted every support system available through my workplace, positioning herself as the responsible family member, arranging help for someone who was too compromised to seek assistance independently. She had turned employee benefits designed to help workers through difficult times into weapons for destroying my professional reputation. Jennifer, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not experiencing the kind of crisis my sister described. She's misrepresenting a family dispute to make me look unstable. Of course, and participation in EAP services is always voluntary. But Ms. Walsh, when family members reach out expressing concerns about someone's mental health, we do take that seriously. If you're comfortable sharing, can you tell me more about the family situation that prompted her calls? I found myself in the impossible position of having to defend my sanity to workplace counselors because my sister had preemptively painted me as someone having a breakdown. Every conversation required me to explain that I wasn't the unstable family member refusing reasonable help, but rather the victim of an elaborate property theft scheme. The afternoon brought a new level of professional sabotage. 3 different co-workers approached me privately to share that they had received calls from someone claiming to be my sister. The conversations were variations on the same theme. Sarah was worried about me, I was going through a difficult time, and my friends should encourage me to accept family help that I was stubbornly rejecting. She seemed really concerned, said my cubicle neighbor Tracy. She said you were isolating yourself from family support and making decisions that weren't in your best interest. She asked me to encourage you to be more open to accepting help from people who love you. Sarah had obtained contact information from my coworkers, probably through social media research, and was systematically calling them to build a narrative about my supposed instability. She was crowdsourcing character assassination, enlisting my professional contacts as unwitting participants in her manipulation campaign. The most damaging call had been to Robert Chen, the department head, who would make decisions about my upcoming promotion review. Sarah had positioned herself as a concerned family member, worried that workplace stress was exacerbating my personal problems, suggesting that additional responsibilities might not be appropriate given my current emotional challenges. By 4 p.m., I felt like my professional life was collapsing around me. My supervisor was documenting concerns about my fitness for work. Human Resources was monitoring my situation for liability issues. My promotion prospects were being undermined by family members who were sabotaging my reputation while claiming to be concerned about my well-being. But the worst part was the gradual shift in how coworkers treated me. People who had been friendly and professional that morning were now speaking to me in the careful, sympathetic tones reserved for someone going through a crisis. They offered to help with my workload, asked if I was holding up okay, and suggested that I should take advantage of family support during difficult times. Sarah's sabotage campaign was working. She had successfully planted the idea that I was an unstable person, refusing reasonable family assistance, and now everyone in my professional life was viewing my situation through that lens. When I finally got home that evening, emotionally drained and professionally humiliated, I found my house transformed. Sarah had spent the day decorating what she was now calling the children's rooms. Emma's artwork was taped to the refrigerator. Ethan's toys were organized in the living room. Family photos featuring Sarah, the children, and my parents had appeared on the mantle. My home was being systematically converted into Sarah's house, while my career was being systematically destroyed to force my compliance. The coordination was too perfect to be coincidental. Someone had advised Sarah to attack both my housing security and my professional stability, simultaneously maximizing pressure while eliminating my resources for resistance. That night, I called Grace Martinez to report the workplace sabotage campaign. Miss Walsh, this actually helps our case significantly. What your sister is doing constitutes harassment, defamation, and potentially tortious interference with your employment. It also suggests a level of coordination that supports our theory about Harold Brennan's involvement in orchestrating your family's tactics. Grace explained that professional reputation destruction was a common element in family property manipulation cases designed to isolate victims and eliminate their ability to seek help or maintain independence. The good news is that your sister has created a documented trail of her malicious behavior. Every call she made to your workplace, every conversation with your coworkers, every contact with employee assistance programs can be evidence of harassment designed to force compliance with property theft. As Grace outlined her plan for documenting Sarah's sabotage campaign, I realized that my family's escalation had provided us with exactly the evidence we needed to expose the entire manipulation scheme. They had been so confident in their tactics that they hadn't considered the possibility that their harassment could become criminal evidence. Tomorrow's meeting with Harold Brennan was going to be very different from what my family expected. Tuesday morning, I arrived at Harold Brennan's office 30 minutes early as Grace had instructed. She was already there, parked across the street in an unmarked car with recording equipment and a private investigator named Marcus Webb, who specialized in documenting legal fraud. The plan was simple. I would attend the meeting as expected, but I would be wearing a wire that would capture Brennan's statements about fraudulent documents and his threats regarding foreclosure proceedings. Grace would remain outside monitoring the conversation and ready to intervene if Brennan's behavior became threatening. "Miss Walsh," Marcus said as he adjusted the tiny recording device hidden in my jacket, "remember that your goal is to get Brennan talking about how he normally handles these cases. Ask him about other families he's helped with property transfers. Get him to explain his methods." My parents and Sarah were already in Brennan's lobby when I arrived. They looked nervous, but determined, clearly expecting this meeting to finalize my surrender of the house. Sarah had brought a folder of what appeared to be moving logistics and school enrollment papers for the children, as if my compliance was already guaranteed. Brennan's office was decorated with family photos and legal awards designed to project trustworthiness and success. but Grace had warned me to look for signs of his specialized practice, and I quickly spotted them legal texts about family property law certificates from seminars on elder financial planning, and a bookshelf filled with case files labeled with family names rather than business entities. "Miss Walsh, I'm glad you decided to join us today," Brennan said, gesturing toward a chair positioned directly across from his desk. "I hope you've had time to consider the benefits of voluntary cooperation in this property transfer." The way he phrased everything as voluntary cooperation, while surrounded by family pressure and threats of foreclosure, was clearly calculated. He was creating a legal record suggesting that any property transfer would be my choice, rather than the result of coercion. "Mr. Brennan, I'd like to understand your experience with cases like this. How many families have you helped with property redistributions?" His smile was practiced and confident. "Oh, I've been specializing in family property optimization for about 8 years now. I'd estimate I've successfully facilitated transfers in over 40 cases, maybe 50. Families are often surprised at how much smoother the process is when they have experienced legal guidance." Sarah leaned forward eagerly. "See, Joanne Harold knows what he's doing. He's helped lots of families work through these situations." "What kind of situations exactly?" I pressed. Brennan opened a file folder and spread several documents across his desk. "Typically, we see families where property ownership doesn't align with current family needs. Single adults with large houses, elderly parents with more space than they can maintain, sometimes divorced individuals who end up with assets that would better serve families with children." My father nodded approvingly. Harold explained that property should serve the family's greatest good, not just individual preferences. "And how do you convince people to transfer property when they're initially resistant?" Brennan's expression became slightly sharper, more calculating. "Well, most people become reasonable once they understand their legal obligations and family responsibilities. Co-signer agreements often include provisions that give families more flexibility than people realize. And of course, there are always financial incentives that make cooperation attractive." "What kind of financial incentives?" "For instance, in your case, your father's co-signer status gives him certain rights regarding property use and transfer. If you were to force foreclosure proceedings by refusing reasonable family accommodation, you'd lose all your equity and damage your credit permanently. Voluntary transfer preserves your financial position while serving the family's needs." I caught my breath. Brennan was admitting that the foreclosure threats were designed to coerce compliance and that co-signer agreements were being used in ways that might not be legally valid. "Mr. Brennan, how often do families actually proceed to foreclosure when someone refuses voluntary transfer?" His laugh was cold and knowing. "Miss Walsh, in 8 years of practice, I've never had a case go to foreclosure. People always become reasonable when they understand the full scope of their legal exposure and family obligations. The key is helping them see that cooperation serves their long-term interests." Sarah was taking notes, apparently fascinated by Brennan's expertise in family manipulation, but I was focused on getting him to reveal more about his methods. "What about families where the property owner gets independent legal advice?" Brennan's expression darkened slightly. "That can complicate matters unnecessarily. Most local attorneys understand that family property disputes are sensitive situations best resolved through cooperation rather than adversarial proceedings. I generally recommend that families work with counsel who specialize in collaborative solutions rather than contentious litigation." Translation: he had relationships with local lawyers who wouldn't challenge his schemes, and he steered families away from attorneys who might expose his fraud. "Have you ever had cases where the property transfer documents were challenged?" "Miss Walsh, are you questioning the validity of your own mortgage agreements? Because I assure you everything we're proposing is based on legally binding commitments your father made as co-signer." My mother spoke up, sounding anxious. "Joanne, why are you asking all these questions? Harold has explained everything clearly. Let's just get this settled so the children can start their new life." But I pressed forward knowing that Grace was recording every word. Mr. Brennan, can you explain exactly which mortgage documents give my father authority to force property transfers? Yum. He pulled out a copy of the document I had questioned, the one with the suspicious family welfare clause. This co-signer agreement specifically states that property use must serve the family's best interests, particularly when minor children are involved. Your father has both the right and the responsibility to ensure this property serves its highest and best use. When was this document added to my mortgage file? Brennan's pause was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Miss Walsh, all co-signer agreements are executed simultaneously with primary mortgage documents. Your father signed these provisions when he agreed to co-sign your loan. But I don't remember signing this particular page. Young adults often don't pay close attention to complex legal documents, especially when they're focused on achieving homeownership goals. Your signature isn't required on co-signer specific provisions. There it was, Brennan admitting that documents in my mortgage file didn't require my signature, which supported Grace's theory about fraudulent additions to originally legitimate paperwork. Sarah looked concerned about the direction of my questions. Joanne, what does it matter when things were signed? The point is that Dad has the legal right to make decisions about family property, and Harold is helping us do what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone, or what's most profitable for Mr. Brennan? The room went silent. Brennan's friendly expression disappeared, replaced by something much colder and more threatening. Miss Walsh, I'm beginning to think you're not approaching this situation with the good faith cooperation your family deserves. Perhaps we should discuss the consequences of forcing adversarial proceedings when family members are trying to help you. My father looked upset. Joanne, Harold is trying to help us. Why are you being so difficult? Dad, did you know that Mr. Brennan's fee is based on the value of property that gets transferred? The more my house is worth, the more money he makes from this deal. Brennan stood up abruptly. Miss Walsh, my fee structure is clearly outlined in my retainer agreement with your family. What I find concerning is your apparent willingness to prioritize material possessions over your niece and nephew's welfare. And I find it concerning that you've been advising my family to lie about their motivations while adding fraudulent documents to my mortgage file. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. My parents looked confused and alarmed, clearly not understanding what I was suggesting. Sarah's face went pale, possibly realizing for the first time that the legal foundation of their property grab might not be solid. Brennan's voice became dangerously quiet. Miss Walsh, are you accusing me of professional misconduct? I'm asking questions about documents that appear to have been altered without my knowledge or consent. He moved to his office door and opened it. I think this meeting is over. Your family will need to decide whether they want to proceed with legal remedies for your breach of family obligations or whether they prefer to find alternative solutions to their housing needs. As we filed out of his office, I could see Grace in her car across the street giving me a thumbs-up signal. We had gotten exactly what we needed, Brennan admitting to his pattern of family manipulation, confirming his financial incentives, and revealing his methods for pressuring compliance. But more importantly, we had evidence that he was using documents that might not be legally valid and making threats about foreclosure proceedings that exceeded his actual authority. In the parking lot, my family surrounded me with expressions ranging from confusion to anger. Joanne, what was that about? My mother demanded. Why were you attacking Harold when he's trying to help us? Because I don't think he's helping us, Mom. I think he's running a scam that's going to hurt all of us. Sarah was crying again, but this time it seemed more genuine than manipulative. Joanne, if Harold can't help us, what are we going to do? I already gave notice on my apartment. The children need somewhere to live. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt sorry for Sarah rather than angry at her. She had been manipulated by a professional con artist who specialized in exploiting family crises for personal profit. Her desperate situation had made her vulnerable to someone who promised easy solutions through legal manipulation. Sarah, there are legitimate ways to solve housing problems, ways that don't involve stealing other people's property. My father looked older and more confused than I had ever seen him. Joanne, I don't understand what you're suggesting. Harold showed us legal documents. Everything he proposed is based on agreements I signed. Dad, I think those agreements might have been altered or forged. I think Harold Brennan has been lying to all of us. As I drove away from Brennan's office, leaving my family to grapple with the possibility that they had been victims of fraud, I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. Grace's investigation was moving forward, but the damage to my family relationships was becoming irreparable. The question was whether exposing Brennan's crimes would help my family understand what they had done, or whether they would simply blame me for destroying their solution to Sarah's housing crisis. Either way, I was committed to seeing this through to the end. Grace wasted no time launching our counteroffensive. By Wednesday morning, she had filed 3 separate legal actions that would transform my family's property theft scheme into a criminal investigation with serious consequences for everyone involved. The first filing was an emergency injunction preventing any property transfers related to my house. Grace had taken the recording from Brennan's office, combined it with evidence of document fraud, and convinced a judge that immediate intervention was necessary to prevent irreversible harm to my property rights. The second filing was a complaint with the State Bar Association documenting Brennan's pattern of family property manipulation, including evidence from 3 other families who'd been victimized by similar schemes. Grace had been building this case for 2 years, and my situation provided the final pieces needed to pursue professional sanctions. The third filing was the one that would hit my family hardest, a report to the State Welfare Fraud Investigation Unit documenting Sarah's false claims about homelessness while living in my house and collecting housing assistance benefits she was no longer entitled to receive. Miss Walsh, Grace explained as we reviewed the filings in her office, your sister has been claiming emergency housing assistance for families with dependent children, but she's been living in your house for over a week, which means she provided false information on her benefit applications. I stared at the welfare fraud documentation, feeling sick. Grace, I didn't know Sarah was receiving housing assistance. She never mentioned any government benefits. That's because she knows it's fraud. Emergency housing assistance is specifically for families who are homeless or at immediate risk of homelessness. By moving into your house while maintaining her benefit claims, she's been stealing from programs designed to help legitimately desperate families. The evidence was overwhelming. Grace had obtained copies of Sarah's recent benefit applications, which claimed continued residency at her former apartment and described urgent need for housing assistance due to unsafe living conditions. But her social media posts showed her and the children happily settled in my house, treating it as their permanent home. How much money are we talking about? Grace consulted her notes. Based on her family size and claimed housing costs probably around $1,500 per month in various assistance programs. If she's been fraudulently claiming benefits while living in your house, we're looking at potential felony charges. The irony was devastating. While my family had been pressuring me to sacrifice my house for Sarah's children, she had been stealing money from programs designed to help families who actually needed assistance. The moral high ground they had claimed about putting children's needs first was completely undermined by Sarah's willingness to defraud taxpayers. But Grace had saved the most shocking revelation for last. Miss Walsh, I need to show you something we discovered about Harold Brennan's background. He's not just running property manipulation schemes. He's part of a larger operation that targets families in financial crisis. She opened a thick file folder containing documents I didn't recognize. Brennan works with real estate investors who specialize in acquiring undervalued residential properties. His job is to identify families with equity-rich homes who can be manipulated into selling below market value or transferring property under duress. My blood ran cold. You're saying this was never about helping Sarah's family? The property assessment report we found in Brennan's documents wasn't just evaluating your house for family transfer. It was evaluating it for potential acquisition by investors who flip houses for profit. Your family was being set up to transfer property that would then be immediately resold for substantial profit. Grace showed me incorporation documents for something called Family Property Solutions, LLC, which listed Brennan as managing partner alongside 3 real estate investors. The company's business model was described as facilitating efficient property transfers from individual ownership to investment management. Sarah and your parents thought they were getting your house for their family's use, but the actual plan was for them to transfer the property to Brennan's investment company, which would pay off Sarah's debts and provide her with temporary housing while they prepared the property for resale. The scope of the fraud was breathtaking. My family hadn't just been manipulated into stealing my house. They had been manipulated into stealing it for criminals who specialized in property theft through legal manipulation. Sarah would have ended up with some debt relief and short-term housing, while Brennan and his partners would have made hundreds of thousands of dollars from the forced sale of my house. Grace, do my parents know about the real estate investment angle? I doubt it. Brennan's method is to convince families that they're solving internal housing disputes while concealing the external profit motives. Your parents probably believe they're helping their daughter and grandchildren, not facilitating property theft for strangers. As Grace explained the full scope of Brennan's operation, I realized my family had been victims almost as much as I had. They had been targeted specifically because Sarah's financial crisis made them vulnerable to manipulation, and because my property ownership created an opportunity for substantial profit. But being victims didn't excuse their willingness to destroy my life for their perceived benefit. And it didn't excuse Sarah's welfare fraud or my parents' casual dismissal of my rights and achievements. Thursday morning brought the first consequences of Grace's filings. Sarah called me at 6 a.m. sobbing hysterically. "Joanne, what did you do? There are investigators here asking about housing assistance fraud. They're saying I could go to prison. The children are terrified." "Sarah, where are you?" "I'm at Mom and Dad's house. These people showed up at your house this morning with badges and official papers. They said I was fraudulently claiming benefits while living somewhere else. Joanne, I don't understand what's happening." I felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. The consequences were beginning, but they were affecting Emma and Ethan, who had no understanding of their mother's choices. "Sarah, did you apply for housing assistance while you were living in my house?" I didn't think it mattered. Harold said the property transfer was going to happen anyway, so technically I was still homeless until it was finalized. He said it was okay to keep receiving benefits during the transition period. There it was, Brennan had advised Sarah to commit welfare fraud, probably knowing it would create additional leverage against my family once his real estate investment scheme was revealed. Sarah Harold Brennan has been lying to all of us. He's not trying to help your family. He's trying to steal my house for his own profit. "What are you talking about? Harold is our lawyer. He's helping us get the house for the children." I spent the next 20 minutes explaining Grace's discoveries about Brennan's real estate investment operation and the evidence of document fraud in my mortgage file. Sarah listened in growing horror as she realized she had been manipulated into committing crimes for someone else's financial benefit. "Joanne, if this is true, what happens to me? What happens to the children?" "That depends on whether you're willing to cooperate with the investigation and testify about how Brennan manipulated our family." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she had hung up. Finally, she spoke in a voice I barely recognized. "Joanne, I'm so sorry. I thought I was doing what was best for my children. I thought you were being selfish, and I thought Harold was helping us find a legal solution. I never meant for this to happen." It was the first genuine apology I had received from any family member since this nightmare began. But it was also too little, too late. The damage to our relationships, to my career, to my sense of family safety, couldn't be undone by belated recognition of what she had participated in. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. Even if Harold had been legitimate, what you were asking me to do was wrong. You were asking me to sacrifice everything I had built so you could avoid the consequences of your own financial choices." "I know," she whispered. "I know that now. But Joanne, I was desperate. The apartment conversion deadline was getting closer, and I didn't know what else to do. When Harold said there was a legal way to get help from family, it seemed like a miracle. Friday morning brought more consequences. My father called to tell me that Brennan had stopped returning their calls and that his office phone was going straight to voicemail. The investigation had apparently moved fast enough to force him to abandon his current operations. Joanne, I think you might be right about Harold. I went back to look at the papers he had me sign, and I'm not sure I understood what I was agreeing to. Dad, what exactly did you sign? There were so many documents. Something about co-signer transfer of authority, something about family property management, something about investment partnership agreements. I thought it was all related to helping Sarah, but now I'm wondering if there were other things mixed in. Grace's investigation had revealed that Brennan typically convinced family members to sign multiple documents during emotionally charged meetings, mixing legitimate family agreements with papers that gave his investment company control over property transfers. My father had probably unknowingly signed documents that would have given Brennan's partners authority to sell my house, regardless of my family's wishes. Dad, you need to bring all those papers to Grace Martinez's office. She needs to see everything you signed. Joanne, are we going to prison? Did we break laws by trying to help Sarah? The pain in his voice reminded me that my parents were in their 70s, had been manipulated by a professional criminal, and were now facing potential legal consequences for choices they hadn't fully understood. But they were also dealing with consequences of their willingness to sacrifice my rights for Sarah's benefit, their casual dismissal of my life achievements, and their participation in an elaborate scheme to steal my property. Dad, that depends on how much you cooperate with the investigation and whether you're willing to help other families avoid what Harold did to us. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Grace's counterattack had accomplished exactly what we had hoped, exposing the fraud, protecting my property, and forcing my family to confront the reality of what they had participated in. But it had also destroyed any possibility of normal family relationships. Even if criminal charges were avoided, even if everyone learned from their mistakes, the trust and love that had once defined our family connections had been permanently damaged. The question was whether justice was worth that price. Grace's suggestion that we take the story public initially made me uncomfortable. The idea of sharing my family's betrayal and manipulation with strangers felt like another violation, even if it was self-directed, but her reasoning was compelling. Brennan's property theft operation had succeeded with other families, because victims were too embarrassed to report the schemes publicly. Miss Walsh predators like Brennan count on family shame and privacy concerns to protect their operations. If we can document this case publicly, it creates a resource for other families to recognize similar manipulation before they lose their property. On Saturday morning, I sat in my kitchen with my laptop staring at a blank social media post while trying to figure out how to explain the most humiliating experience of my life to an audience of acquaintances, co-workers, and distant relatives. Grace had helped me organize the key evidence photos of the fraudulent mortgage documents recordings of Brennan's admissions about his manipulation tactics, copies of Sarah's welfare fraud applications, and documentation of the real estate investment scheme that had been concealed behind claims of family assistance. The post I finally wrote was longer than anything I had ever shared publicly, but every detail felt necessary to help other people recognize similar schemes. I need to share something that's been happening to my family because I've learned that we're not the first people to be targeted by this kind of manipulation, and we won't be the last. 3 weeks ago, I received legal documents demanding that I surrender my house to my sister's family because childless adults should sacrifice for those with children. The documents were signed by my father, who had co-signed my mortgage 10 years ago, and they claimed he had legal authority to force property transfer based on family welfare clauses in my mortgage agreement. What followed was a coordinated campaign of guilt manipulation and harassment designed to force my compliance. My family hired a lawyer named Harold Brennan, who specialized in what he called family property optimization. They launched social media campaigns about children's housing needs. They contacted my workplace to suggest I was mentally unstable. They moved into my house without permission and told my niece and nephew it was their new home. But here's what I discovered. Harold Brennan wasn't trying to help my family. He was running a property theft scheme designed to steal houses from individuals and transfer them to real estate investors for profit. The family welfare clause in my mortgage was fraudulent, added to my file without my knowledge or consent. My sister was committing welfare fraud by claiming housing assistance while living in my house, and the entire operation was designed to generate hundreds of thousands of dollars for criminals who specialize in manipulating families during financial crises. I'm sharing this because other families are being targeted by similar schemes right now. If someone contacts you about optimizing family property distribution or claims that co-signers have authority to force property transfers, please get independent legal advice before signing anything. If family members suddenly start pressuring you to transfer property for the good of the family, ask hard questions about who's really benefiting from these arrangements. And if you're a parent or relative who thinks adult children without kids don't deserve their property as much as family members who have reproduced, please reconsider that belief. My decade of hard work and financial responsibility wasn't less valuable than my sister's choices, and my rights weren't less important because I chose not to have children. Property theft through family manipulation is a real crime with real victims. Don't let it happen to your family. I attached photos of the key evidence, including Brennan's business incorporation documents showing the real estate investment connections and screenshots of my sister's social media posts that contradicted her claims of homelessness. Then I hit publish and waited to see what would happen. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 2 hours, the post had been shared over 300 times. Comments poured in from people sharing their own experiences with family property manipulation, predatory lawyers and relatives who had tried to use guilt and family obligation to obtain assets they hadn't earned. But the comment that shocked me most came from someone I didn't recognize. "Oh my God, Harold Brennan did this exact same thing to my family 2 years ago. He convinced my grandparents to sign over their house to my uncle using the same family welfare language. We lost everything because we didn't know how to fight it." More people began sharing similar experiences. A woman whose brother had used co-signer status to force sale of her house during a contentious divorce. A man whose sister had convinced their elderly parents to transfer property using fabricated legal documents. A family who had lost their generational farm to relatives who claimed they needed it more for their children's future. The comments section became a support group for victims of family property theft, with people sharing resources, legal advice, and emotional support for others dealing with similar betrayal. By evening, local news reporters were calling me. The story of family property manipulation using fraudulent legal documents was exactly the kind of consumer protection angle that generated viewer interest and public awareness. Channel 7's investigative reporter Amanda Rodriguez wanted to interview me for their Wednesday evening Consumer Alert segment. "Miss Walsh, we've been tracking reports of property manipulation schemes targeting families in financial crisis, but we haven't had anyone willing to go on record about their experience. Your story could help a lot of people recognize these tactics before they become victims." I agreed to the interview despite my lingering discomfort with public exposure. If my humiliation could help other families avoid similar manipulation, it felt like a worthwhile sacrifice. The Channel 7 interview aired on Wednesday evening during prime time. Amanda had done her own investigation of Brennan's operation, confirming details about his real estate investment partnerships and identifying 4 other families who had been victimized by similar schemes. The segment included my interview explaining how the property theft scheme had worked footage of Grace describing the legal manipulation tactics and statements from other victims who had agreed to share their experiences anonymously. But the most powerful part of the segment was the revelation that Brennan had disappeared completely. His law office was closed, his phone numbers were disconnected, and his real estate investment partners were claiming they had no knowledge of his family manipulation activities. Harold Brennan appears to have abandoned his current operations and may be setting up similar schemes in other states, Amanda reported. Law enforcement agencies across the region are coordinating to track his activities and warn potential victims. The news coverage generated another wave of social media attention. My original post was shared over 2,000 times, and dozens of people commented with thanks for raising awareness about family property manipulation. But the attention also brought unwanted consequences. Several family, friends, and extended relatives who had previously supported Sarah's narrative about my selfishness now contacted me with apologies and offers of support. My Aunt Patricia, who had called me weeks earlier to encourage family cooperation, left a voicemail expressing shock about Brennan's criminal operation and shame about pressuring me to comply with what she now understood was property theft. Joanne, honey, I'm so sorry. When Sarah explained the situation, she made it sound like you were being unreasonable about helping children in need. I had no idea there were criminals involved or that she was lying about so many things. The public exposure had completely reversed the narrative my family had been promoting. Instead of being seen as the selfish relative who refused to help children, I was now viewed as the victim of an elaborate fraud scheme who had courageously exposed criminals and protected her property rights. Sarah's former allies were distancing themselves from her, and social media comments that had once supported her housing needs now criticized her participation in welfare fraud and family manipulation. But the most significant response came from my employer. Janet Richardson called me Friday afternoon with news that transformed my professional situation completely. Joanne, I owe you a serious apology. After seeing the news coverage about your family's situation, I realized that your sister's calls to our office were part of a harassment campaign designed to undermine your professional standing. I'm formally documenting this as a case of family harassment rather than employee instability, and I want you to know that your job security and promotion prospects are completely unaffected by this situation. Several co-workers also reached out to express support and apologize for treating me as emotionally unstable when I had actually been dealing with sophisticated criminal manipulation. The public exposure had accomplished everything Grace and I had hoped, generating awareness about family property theft schemes, forcing accountability for my family's choices, and restoring my professional reputation. But it had also made the destruction of my family relationships permanent and irreversible. There would be no possibility of reconciliation with people who had been exposed publicly as participants in criminal fraud. As I read through hundreds of supportive comments from strangers who appreciated my courage in sharing such a painful experience, I wondered whether the validation was worth the price of losing my family forever. The answer I realized was yes, because protecting myself and helping other families recognize similar manipulation was more important than preserving relationships built on the assumption that my rights and achievements mattered less than other people's needs. Monday morning brought the news I had been waiting for. Judge Patricia Sullivan had issued a comprehensive ruling that not only protected my property, but also laid the groundwork for criminal prosecution of Harold Brennan and his associates. Grace called me at 7 a.m., barely containing her excitement. "Miss Walsh, we got everything we asked for and more. The court found clear evidence of document fraud, elder abuse, and a pattern of criminal manipulation targeting families in financial distress." The judge's 43-page ruling was devastating in its criticism of Brennan's methods and my family's participation in the property theft scheme. Judge Sullivan had examined every piece of evidence we presented and concluded that the entire operation was a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to exploit family dynamics for financial profit. The fraudulent family welfare clause in my mortgage documents was declared invalid and unenforceable, with the court noting that the document had been clearly altered without the knowledge or consent of the primary borrower. The judge's analysis included forensic examination of the paperwork that revealed the clause had been printed on different paper stock and attached to my original mortgage file months after my house purchase. Miss Walsh, your father never had any legal authority to force property transfer, Grace explained as she walked me through the ruling. Co-signers are liable for loan payments if borrowers default, but they don't acquire ownership rights or decision-making authority over property use. Everything Brennan told your family about your father's supposed powers was complete fabrication. The court also addressed the foreclosure threats that had been used to pressure my compliance. Judge Sullivan found that Brennan's claims about calling in my mortgage were legally impossible and constituted fraudulent misrepresentation designed to coerce victim compliance through manufactured fear. But the ruling went beyond just protecting my property. Judge Sullivan had ordered a complete investigation of Brennan's real estate investment partnerships, frozen assets belonging to Family Property Solutions, LLC, and referred the case to federal authorities for prosecution of what appeared to be an interstate property theft operation. The court believes this scheme has victimized families across multiple states, Grace said. Your willingness to fight back and document everything may have exposed one of the largest family property theft operations law enforcement has ever investigated. The ruling also addressed Sarah's welfare fraud directly. Judge Sullivan found that her false claims about homelessness while living in my house constituted deliberate deception of government assistance programs and ordered full restitution of fraudulently obtained benefits plus penalties. How much money does Sarah have to pay back? Grace consulted her notes. Including penalties and interest, approximately $8,000. Plus, she's been banned from receiving housing assistance benefits for 5 years, and she'll have to complete community service focused on helping legitimately homeless families. The irony was perfect. Sarah would now be required to help families who were actually experiencing the housing crisis she had falsely claimed to be facing. But the most satisfying part of the ruling was the court's recognition of the harassment campaign that had targeted my workplace and professional reputation. Judge Sullivan found that Sarah's calls to my employer constituted tortious interference with employment and awarded me damages for the professional harm her manipulation had caused. Miss Walsh, the court has ordered your sister to pay $15,000 in damages for defamation and harassment. Additionally, she's required to contact your employer and formally retract any statements she made questioning your competence or stability. Wednesday afternoon brought even better news. The State Bar Association had formally suspended Harold Brennan's law license, pending investigation of ethics violations, and federal investigators had obtained warrants for his arrest on charges of wire fraud, elder abuse, and operating a criminal enterprise. They found him in Nevada trying to set up the same operation under a different name, Grace reported. Apparently, he's been running family property theft schemes across the western states for over a decade. Your case provided the evidence they needed to connect his activities and file federal charges. The FBI had also arrested 2 of Brennan's real estate investment partners and seized assets including luxury cars, vacation properties, and investment accounts funded through forced property sales from manipulated families. Miss Walsh, the federal investigation has identified at least 15 other families who lost property through Brennan's schemes. Your courage in fighting back and going public may have prevented dozens of additional families from being victimized. Friday brought the final piece of legal vindication. My parents had agreed to cooperate fully with the federal investigation in exchange for reduced charges related to their participation in the property theft scheme. My father's cooperation was particularly valuable because he had kept copies of all the documents Brennan had presented during family meetings, including incorporation papers for the real estate investment company that revealed the true scope of the criminal operation. Your father seems genuinely shocked by the extent of Brennan's deception, Grace explained. He really believed he was helping his family, not facilitating property theft for strangers. The federal investigators think his testimony will be crucial for prosecuting the entire network. My mother had also provided evidence about Brennan's manipulation tactics, including recordings she had made of phone conversations where he coached her on how to pressure me for compliance. The recordings revealed Brennan's sophisticated understanding of family psychology and his calculated approach to destroying my resistance. Miss Walsh, your mother's recordings show Brennan explicitly instructing your family to attack your professional reputation, isolate you from support systems, and create housing emergencies that would force your compliance. It's textbook coercive manipulation, and it's going to be devastating evidence at his trial. The legal victories were comprehensive and satisfying, but they came with complicated emotional consequences. My family's cooperation with federal investigators had helped expose a criminal network and protect other families, but it had also required them to acknowledge the full extent of their betrayal and manipulation. Sarah's required retraction statement to my employer was particularly humiliating for her, as she had to formally admit that her claims about my instability were false statements made to coerce compliance with property transfer demands that I now understand were criminal in nature. My father's testimony about signing documents he didn't understand had helped prosecutors understand how elderly family members were manipulated into providing legal authority for property theft, but it had also forced him to confront his willingness to sacrifice my rights for what he perceived as family needs. The financial consequences for my family were severe. Sarah owed over $20,000 in welfare fraud restitution and harassment damages. My parents faced potential civil liability for their participation in document fraud, and all of them were required to participate in financial counseling programs designed to help families recognize and resist manipulation schemes. But the legal victories had accomplished everything I had hoped for my property was completely protected. The criminals who had targeted my family were facing serious prosecution, and other families were being warned about similar manipulation tactics. Most importantly, the court had formally recognized that my rights as a childless adult were equal to my sister's rights as a parent, and that family relationships didn't justify property theft or manipulation. As Grace and I celebrated the successful conclusion of the legal proceedings, I felt a complex mixture of vindication, sadness, and relief. Justice had been served, criminals had been prosecuted, and my property had been protected. But the price had been the complete destruction of my family relationships and the public exposure of betrayals that would never be forgiven or forgotten. The question was whether the legal victories would be enough to rebuild my life after everything my family had tried to take away from me. The eviction notice I served on Sarah was delivered by the sheriff's department on a cold Tuesday morning in early November. I watched from my kitchen window as the deputy handed her the official papers while Emma and Ethan played in what used to be my backyard, oblivious to the fact that their temporary home was about to disappear. Sarah read the notice twice before looking toward the house where she knew I was watching. Even from a distance, I could see her shoulders shaking as the reality of her situation finally sank in. She had 7 days to vacate my property and find legitimate housing for her children. The court order was explicit. Sarah had no legal right to occupy my house. Her claims about transitional housing arrangements were invalid, and her continued presence constituted criminal trespass. Judge Sullivan had been particularly harsh in her language about family members who exploit children's welfare to justify property theft. But the eviction notice was just the beginning of Sarah's reckoning with the consequences of her choices. The welfare fraud conviction had made her ineligible for most housing assistance programs. Her damaged credit from unpaid debts made rental applications difficult, and her association with Brennan's criminal scheme had become public knowledge that landlords could easily discover through internet searches. My mother called me that afternoon, crying harder than I had heard since my grandfather's funeral. "Joanne, please reconsider the eviction. Those babies don't have anywhere else to go. Sarah made mistakes, but Emma and Ethan are innocent. They don't understand why their family is falling apart." "Mom, where were you planning for them to live when this property transfer was finalized? You knew I was supposed to move to Sarah's apartment." The long silence told me everything I needed to know. My family hadn't actually planned beyond forcing me out of my house. They had assumed I would quietly accept whatever accommodations were offered, probably expecting me to remain available to provide free childcare and maintenance services for the property they intended to steal. We thought you might stay in the apartment temporarily just until Sarah got settled and the children adjusted to their new school. And then I would live in Sarah's cramped apartment forever while she enjoyed my house. Joanne, we didn't think through all the details. We were focused on solving the immediate crisis with the children's housing. The casual dismissal of my future was breathtaking. My parents had been willing to destroy my life based on vague assumptions that I would somehow make the best of whatever situation remained after Sarah's needs were prioritized. Mom Sarah created her housing crisis by giving up her apartment without securing alternatives. I didn't create this problem, and I'm not responsible for solving it. But the children are Sarah's responsibility. If she can't provide adequate housing, there are social services designed to help families in genuine crisis. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected visit from my father, who appeared at my front door looking frail and defeated. He had aged 10 years in the past month, and his usual confidence had been replaced by something that looked like shame. "Joanne, can I come in? I need to talk to you." I led him into what had been his family home for countless holidays and celebrations, but the atmosphere between us was strained and formal. He sat heavily in the living room chair where he used to read bedtime stories to Emma and Ethan, looking around at the space he had tried to take away from me. "I want you to know that I understand what I did wrong," he said quietly. "The federal investigators explained how Harold manipulated all of us, but that doesn't excuse my willingness to sacrifice your rights for what I thought was family welfare." "Dad, do you understand that even if Harold had been legitimate, what you were asking me to do was wrong?" He nodded slowly. "I spent so much time thinking about those children's needs that I forgot you're my child too. I forgot that your life and choices and achievements matter just as much as Sarah's." It was the acknowledgement I had been waiting to hear, but it came too late to repair the damage. Trust once broken by such fundamental betrayal couldn't be restored through belated recognition of wrongdoing. "Dad, you didn't just forget about my needs. You actively worked to destroy my life when I refused to sacrifice everything for Sarah's benefit." "I know, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." He pulled out a manila envelope and set it on the coffee table between us. "I've prepared something that I hope will help you understand how sorry I am." Inside the envelope was a quitclaim deed formally releasing any potential co-signer claims on my property, along with a notarized letter acknowledging that he had participated in a scheme to fraudulently transfer my house and accepting full responsibility for his role in the attempted property theft. "I've also included a check for $20,000 to compensate you for the legal fees and emotional distress my actions caused. It's not enough, but it's what I can afford after paying the penalties for my participation in Harold's scheme." The gesture was meaningful, but it also highlighted the permanent damage to our relationship. My father was essentially paying me settlement money for the harm he had caused, treating our family bond like a legal dispute that could be resolved through financial compensation. "Dad, I appreciate this, but money can't fix what happened between us." "I know, but I needed you to know that I recognize the full scope of what I did wrong and that I'm taking responsibility for the consequences." Friday brought the final family confrontation I had been dreading. Sarah appeared at my door with Emma and Ethan using the children as shields for one last manipulation attempt. "Joanne, I know you hate me and I deserve that, but please don't punish Emma and Ethan for my mistakes. Let us stay until I can find suitable housing for them." The children looked confused and scared, clearly sensing the adult tension, but not understanding why their temporary home was being taken away. Emma was clutching a drawing she had made of our family, standing together in front of my house, probably created in art therapy to help her process the family crisis. "Aunt Joanne," Emma said in her small, serious voice, "Mommy says we might have to move to a different house, but I like this house. Can't we all just live here together?" My heart broke for her innocence and confusion. Emma had no understanding of property rights, mortgage payments, or the criminal scheme that had brought her family to my house. She just knew that adults were fighting, and her sense of security was being threatened. But I also recognized the manipulation in Sarah's decision to bring the children for this conversation. She was counting on my love for Emma and Ethan to override my determination to protect my property and rights. "Emma, sweetheart, this is Aunt Joanne's house. You and Mommy and Ethan have your own home somewhere else." But Mommy said our old home was too small and we needed a bigger one for me and Ethan to be happy. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she heard her own manipulation tactics reflected in her daughter's innocent words. She had taught Emma to believe that they deserved my house more than I did, and now she was confronting the consequences of that psychological manipulation. "Sarah, you have until Sunday to vacate my property. If you're still here Monday morning, the sheriff will remove you and the children, and that will be much more traumatic than leaving voluntarily." "Joanne, where are we supposed to go? The homeless shelter won't take families with fraud convictions. Most landlords won't rent to someone with my credit history. I've applied for dozens of apartments and been rejected by all of them." For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah was facing the real consequences of her choices without family support or criminal assistance. The housing crisis she had claimed to be experiencing was now genuine, created by her own actions rather than external circumstances. "Sarah, those are problems you created through your own choices. You gave up your apartment, committed welfare fraud, and participated in a criminal scheme to steal my house. The consequences are yours to handle." As I watched Sarah leave with the children, probably for the last time they would visit my house, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. The family relationships that had once been the foundation of my emotional life were ending permanently, but the alternative was continuing to accept manipulation, betrayal, and exploitation, disguised as family loyalty. Sunday evening, I watched from my porch as Sarah loaded her possessions and the children into her minivan for the final time. The house felt empty and quiet after weeks of constant child voices and family drama, but it also felt like mine again. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "I hope someday you can forgive us for what we did. The children will always love their Aunt Joanne, even if they don't understand why we had to leave." I didn't respond to the text. There was nothing left to say to someone who continued to frame property theft and criminal manipulation as misguided family assistance that deserved forgiveness. But as I sat in my reclaimed living room that evening, I realized that the family reckoning had accomplished something important. It had forced everyone to acknowledge the truth about what they had attempted to do to me, and it had established clear consequences for treating my rights as negotiable. The question was whether I could build a new life from the ruins of my old family relationships, and whether the justice I had achieved was worth the loneliness that remained. My return to normal workplace dynamics proved more challenging than I had anticipated. Even though Janet Richardson had formally cleared my record of any performance concerns related to my family crisis, the lingering effects of Sarah's harassment campaign required careful management and deliberate reputation rebuilding. The first step was a department-wide meeting where Janet addressed the rumors and misinformation that had circulated about my emotional instability. She explained that my family situation had involved criminal manipulation and harassment, not mental health issues or poor judgment on my part. I want to make it absolutely clear that Joanne was the victim of a sophisticated fraud scheme that included deliberate attempts to undermine her professional reputation, Janet announced to my 23 co-workers. The concerns that were raised about her stability were part of a harassment campaign designed to pressure compliance with property theft demands. The meeting was both vindicating and humiliating. While it officially cleared my reputation, it also required public discussion of my family's betrayal and the criminal scheme they had participated in. Several co-workers approached me afterward with apologies and expressions of support, but I could see the lingering curiosity and pity in their eyes. "Joanne, I'm so sorry we didn't realize what was really happening," said Tracy, my cubicle neighbor. When your sister called me, she sounded so genuinely concerned about you that I never questioned whether she might be lying. Robert Chen, the department head, scheduled a private meeting to discuss my promotion prospects and address any concerns about how the family crisis might affect my professional advancement. Joanne, I want you to know that your handling of this situation has actually demonstrated qualities that make you an even stronger candidate for leadership roles. Your ability to maintain professional standards while dealing with such personal adversity shows exactly the kind of resilience we value. But the most significant professional validation came from an unexpected source. My company's legal department reached out to request my assistance with developing employee protection policies for workplace harassment by family members. Ms. Walsh, your situation has highlighted a gap in our current policies, explained Margaret Torres, the chief legal counsel. We have procedures for dealing with workplace harassment by colleagues or outsiders, but we haven't adequately addressed situations where family members deliberately target employees' professional reputations. My experience became the foundation for new corporate policies, protecting employees from family-based harassment and providing clear procedures for distinguishing between legitimate family emergencies and malicious manipulation designed to damage workplace standing. Your documentation of your sister's harassment campaign and the eventual criminal prosecution has given us a template for recognizing and responding to similar situations in the future, Margaret explained. We'd like to offer you a consulting role in developing training materials for managers who need to identify and address family-based workplace harassment. The consulting opportunity not only provided additional income, but also transformed my humiliating experience into expertise that could help other employees facing similar manipulation. My professional reputation was not just restored, but enhanced by my willingness to share knowledge gained through adversity. Within 6 months, I was invited to speak at regional human resources conferences about recognizing and responding to family-based employee harassment. My presentation, "When Family Becomes the Enemy Protecting Employees from Domestic Manipulation Campaigns," became one of the most requested sessions at workplace safety seminars. Ms. Walsh brings a unique perspective to workplace protection issues, wrote one conference organizer. Her combination of personal experience and professional analysis provides practical guidance that managers can implement immediately to protect vulnerable employees. The speaking opportunities led to additional consulting contracts with corporations seeking to improve their employee assistance programs and develop more sophisticated approaches to family-related workplace disruptions. But the most meaningful professional restoration came from the relationships I rebuilt with colleagues who had initially been skeptical of my family's claims about my instability. David Martinez, a senior analyst who had been particularly influenced by Sarah's manipulation campaign, became one of my strongest workplace allies after understanding the full scope of what my family had attempted. "Joanne, I owe you a massive apology," he said during a team lunch 6 months after the criminal prosecutions concluded. "I actually suggested to Robert that maybe you needed time off to address family issues. I had no idea that your family was actively trying to destroy your career to force compliance with property theft." The workplace relationships that emerged from the crisis were stronger and more genuine than what had existed before. Colleagues who had supported me during the harassment campaign became trusted friends, while those who had been quick to believe family manipulation revealed themselves as people whose judgment I shouldn't rely on. My promotion to senior project manager was approved 8 months after the family crisis began, with Robert Chen noting that my handling of sophisticated manipulation and harassment had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and resilience the department needed. Joanne's ability to maintain professional excellence while fighting for her basic rights shows the kind of character we want representing our team at higher levels, he wrote in my performance evaluation. Her experience with family-based manipulation has also given her insights into interpersonal dynamics that make her particularly effective at managing complex team situations. The promotion came with a significant salary increase and management responsibilities that provided both financial security and professional satisfaction. More importantly, it represented institutional recognition that my family's attempts to destroy my career had not only failed, but had inadvertently demonstrated qualities that made me more valuable as an employee. A year after Sarah's harassment campaign began, I received an unexpected email from Jennifer at the Employee Assistance Program, who had initially been recruited into my sister's manipulation scheme. Miss Walsh, I wanted you to know that your experience has fundamentally changed how our EAP program responds to family-reported concerns about employee well-being. We now have procedures for verifying family claims and distinguishing between legitimate concern and malicious manipulation. Your willingness to educate us about sophisticated harassment tactics has helped us protect other employees from similar attacks. The professional restoration had accomplished more than just clearing my reputation and advancing my career. It had transformed my traumatic experience into expertise that protected other people from family-based workplace harassment and provided me with a sense of purpose beyond my original job responsibilities. But perhaps most importantly, it had proved that my family's attempts to destroy my professional life had backfired completely. Instead of becoming the unstable employee who needed family intervention, I had become the expert consultant who helped other employees recognize and resist family manipulation. My career was not just restored, it was stronger and more meaningful than it had ever been before my family tried to destroy it. The process of rebuilding my social life after cutting ties with my immediate family required deliberate effort and careful boundary setting. I had to learn to distinguish between people who genuinely supported my decisions and those who believed family reconciliation should be prioritized over personal safety and rights. My first challenge came from extended family members who felt entitled to opinions about my decision to pursue criminal charges against my parents and sister. Thanksgiving dinner at my Aunt Patricia's house became a minefield of passive-aggressive comments and unsolicited advice about forgiveness and family unity. "Joanne, don't you think it's time to let go of this anger and focus on healing the family?" asked my cousin Jennifer, who had apparently appointed herself as family mediator. "Your parents are elderly, and Sarah is struggling as a single mother. Holding grudges just hurts everyone. Jennifer, would you forgive family members who tried to steal your house through fraud and then attacked your career when you refused to cooperate?" The uncomfortable silence around the dinner table revealed that most of my extended family wanted me to pretend the attempted property theft had been a misunderstanding rather than a criminal scheme that had destroyed trust permanently. "But they're still your family," insisted my Uncle Robert. "Family forgives and moves forward together. That's what family means." Uncle Robert family also means not trying to steal each other's property or destroy each other's careers. If they had treated me like family, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The expectation that I should prioritize family relationships over personal rights and safety was pervasive among relatives who hadn't experienced the full scope of manipulation and betrayal I had endured. They wanted the comfort of family unity without acknowledging the criminal behavior that had made such unity impossible. After several uncomfortable family gatherings where my decision to maintain boundaries was treated as stubborn vindictiveness, I realized I needed to be more selective about which family relationships were worth preserving. My cousin Michael, who had remained supportive throughout the crisis, became an important ally in navigating family dynamics while maintaining my boundaries. "Joanne, you don't owe anyone forgiveness or reconciliation," he said during one of our regular coffee meetings. "What your parents and Sarah did was criminal, and the fact that it happened within a family doesn't make it less serious or more forgivable." Michael had witnessed some of my family's manipulation tactics firsthand and understood that my boundaries weren't about holding grudges, but about protecting myself from people who had proved themselves capable of significant harm. The family members who are pressuring you to forgive and forget are basically asking you to pretend that attempted property theft is acceptable behavior as long as it's done by relatives, he observed. "That's not family loyalty. That's enabling criminal behavior." Creating new friendships required learning to recognize and avoid people who shared my family's belief that adult children without kids should sacrifice for family members with children. Several potential friendships ended early when new acquaintances expressed opinions that my house was too big for one person, or suggested that my sister probably just needed help. But I also discovered a community of people who understood the challenges of setting boundaries with manipulative family members. A support group for adult children of narcissistic parents provided connection with others who had been forced to choose between family relationships and personal safety. Family-based property theft is more common than people realize, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, the therapist who facilitated the support group. Many adult children face pressure to sacrifice assets, career opportunities, or life choices for family members who claim their needs are more important. The support group taught me that healthy relationships, including family relationships, required mutual respect for individual rights and boundaries. People who believed they were entitled to my assets or compliance with their preferences simply because we shared DNA weren't actually offering family love. They were offering conditional acceptance based on my willingness to prioritize their needs over my own. My friendship with Grace Martinez evolved into a professional mentorship that enriched both my legal knowledge and my understanding of family manipulation patterns. Grace invited me to assist with other family property theft cases, providing insight into victim psychology and manipulation recognition. Ms. Walsh, your experience gives you credibility with other victims that I can't provide as someone who hasn't been personally targeted by these schemes, Grace explained. Many people who are being manipulated by family members find it easier to recognize their own situations when they hear from someone who's been through similar experiences. Working with other families facing property manipulation schemes helped me understand that my experience wasn't unique or particularly severe. Property theft through family guilt and manufactured legal authority was a common pattern that targeted people who had achieved financial success while maintaining strong family loyalty. The work was emotionally challenging but professionally fulfilling. Helping other families recognize and resist manipulation schemes gave meaning to my traumatic experience and provided connections with people who understood the complexity of loving family members while protecting yourself from their harmful behavior. My romantic relationships also required careful navigation of potential partners' attitudes toward family loyalty and boundary setting. Several dating relationships ended when men expressed beliefs that family relationships should be preserved regardless of behavior, or suggested that my family issues indicated character problems. But I also met people who understood that healthy relationships required respect for individual rights and boundaries. David Thompson, an accountant who had gone through his own family financial manipulation experience, became a close friend and eventually a romantic partner who respected my decisions about family contact. The people worth having relationships with will understand why you protect yourself from family members who prove themselves dangerous, David observed. Anyone who thinks you should accept property theft and career sabotage because it came from relatives doesn't understand what healthy relationships look like. A year after establishing no-contact boundaries with my immediate family, I received a letter from Sarah requesting a meeting to discuss the children's need for extended family relationships. The letter was carefully crafted to focus on Emma and Ethan's emotional needs rather than her own desire for reconciliation. I didn't respond to the letter, but I did discuss it with Dr. Chen during a private therapy session focused on maintaining boundaries despite guilt manipulation. Miss Walsh, people who have harmed us often try to re-establish contact by claiming that boundary maintenance hurts innocent third parties, Dr. Chen explained. Your niece and nephew's emotional needs are real, but they're Sarah's responsibility to address, not yours to sacrifice your safety for. The letter represented exactly the kind of manipulation I had learned to recognize using children's welfare to justify behavior that served adult interests. Sarah wasn't concerned about Emma and Ethan's need for extended family. She was concerned about her own need for family support and financial assistance. Maintaining boundaries required constant vigilance against guilt, manipulation, and social pressure, but it also provided the foundation for building relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. The people who remained in my life after I established clear boundaries were those who valued my well-being and respected my right to protect myself from harmful behavior. 2 years after the family crisis began, I had created a chosen family of friends, colleagues, and romantic partner who supported my decisions and respected my boundaries. The relationships were healthier and more genuine than the family connections I had lost, based on mutual care rather than obligation or manipulation. The new boundaries had cost me my relationship with my parents, sister, and several extended family members, but they had also protected me from ongoing manipulation and abuse, while creating space for relationships built on respect and genuine affection. The trade was difficult but ultimately worthwhile, losing family members who saw me as a resource to be exploited in exchange for finding people who saw me as a person deserving of respect and protection. My collaboration with Grace Martinez on family property manipulation cases evolved into a consulting business that provided both professional fulfillment and additional income. Our practice, Family Financial Protection Services, specialized in helping individuals recognize and resist property theft schemes disguised as family assistance. The need for our services was greater than I had initially realized. Within 6 months of establishing the business, we were working with over 30 families facing various forms of property manipulation, from inheritance fraud to forced property transfers to financial elder abuse. Ms. Walsh brings a unique perspective to these cases, Grace explained to potential clients. As someone who successfully fought back against family property theft, she understands both the emotional manipulation tactics and the practical strategies needed to protect assets and rights. My role in the business focused on victim advocacy and manipulation recognition training. I help people understand that family members who demanded property transfers or financial sacrifices were engaging in abuse, not demonstrating love or concern. One of our first clients was Margaret Thompson, a widow whose adult children were pressuring her to sell her house and move into assisted living so they could inherit the property value while she was still alive. They keep telling me the house is too big for one person and that I'd be happier in a smaller place where I don't have to worry about maintenance, Margaret explained during our initial consultation. But I love my house and I'm perfectly capable of maintaining it. I think they just want the money. Margaret's situation was similar to mine in that family members were using guilt and manufactured concern to justify property acquisition that served their interests rather than hers. Her children claimed to be worried about her safety and well-being, while actually being motivated by financial gain. "Margaret, do you want to sell your house and move to assisted living?" I asked. "Absolutely not. This house is where I raised my children and where my husband and I plan to spend our retirement. Moving would break my heart." "Then you don't have to move regardless of what your children want. Your property rights don't disappear because your children think they know what's best for you." Working with Margaret helped me understand that family property manipulation often targeted people during vulnerable periods when they were more susceptible to guilt and pressure. Widowhood, divorce, illness, or financial stress created opportunities for family members to exploit love and loyalty for personal gain. Our business developed educational resources that helped people recognize manipulation tactics before they lost property or rights. We created checklists for identifying family property schemes, guides for protecting assets from relatives, and training materials for attorneys who represented victims of family financial abuse. The educational work led to speaking opportunities at legal conferences, elder advocacy seminars, and family court training programs. My presentation on recognizing family financial abuse, red flags, and response strategies became a standard part of continuing education for family law attorneys and social workers. Ms. Walsh provides invaluable insight into the psychology of family financial abuse, wrote Judge Patricia Sullivan after I presented at a judicial training seminar. Her ability to explain manipulation tactics from the victim's perspective helps legal professionals understand the complexity of these cases and develop more effective protection strategies. The speaking engagements generated media attention that helped raise public awareness about family property manipulation. I was interviewed by consumer protection reporters, featured in articles about financial elder abuse, and invited to participate in legislative hearings about strengthening property protection laws. But the most meaningful aspect of the work was direct assistance to families facing manipulation schemes, similar to what I had experienced. Each successful case felt like validation of my decision to fight back rather than comply with my family's demands. One particularly rewarding case involved Jason Miller, whose brother was trying to force sale of their deceased parents' house by claiming Jason didn't deserve to inherit property since he was unmarried and childless. "My brother keeps saying the house should go to someone who will use it properly for raising a family," Jason explained. "He's pressuring me to sell and split the proceeds, but the house was left to me specifically. I think my parents wanted me to have a place to build my own future." Jason's case was nearly identical to my experienced family members believing that childless adults had less right to property than those who had reproduced. Grace and I helped Jason understand that his inheritance rights couldn't be overridden by his brother's opinions about who deserved the property more. "Jason, your parents chose to leave the house to you for their own reasons. Your brother's feelings about your life choices don't give him any legal or moral claim to your inheritance." We provided Jason with legal representation that protected his inheritance and educational resources that helped him resist his brother's guilt manipulation. The case was resolved within 3 months, with Jason maintaining ownership of the house and his brother accepting that reproductive choices don't determine property rights. A year after starting the consulting business, we had successfully protected over 50 families from property manipulation schemes and helped criminal prosecution of 12 individuals who were targeting families for financial exploitation. The work also led to policy advocacy at the state level. Grace and I testified before legislative committees about the need for stronger protections against family financial abuse and clearer legal definitions of property manipulation crimes. Family financial abuse is significantly underreported because victims are reluctant to pursue legal action against relatives they love. I explained to the State Senate Judiciary Committee, we need laws that specifically address property manipulation within families and provide clear protection for individuals who are being pressured to transfer assets through guilt and manufactured legal claims. Our testimony contributed to passage of the Family Financial Protection Act, which created specific criminal penalties for property manipulation within families and established clearer legal procedures for victims seeking protection from relatives engaging in financial abuse. 2 years after my own family crisis began, I received a letter from Emma, my niece, who was now 5 years old. The letter was clearly dictated to Sarah, but it contained a message that made me reconsider some aspects of my boundary decisions. "Dear Aunt Joanne, I miss you and I hope you are happy. Mommy says you are busy with important work helping other families. I drew you a picture of a house with flowers in the garden like yours. I hope someday I can visit you again. Love, Emma." The letter was accompanied by a crayon drawing of a house that looked remarkably like mine, complete with the wraparound porch and maple trees in the yard. Emma had remembered details from her brief time living in my house and was apparently still processing the loss of that relationship. I didn't respond to the letter, but I did discuss it with Dr. Chen during therapy. "Miss Walsh, it's natural to feel conflicted about maintaining boundaries when they affect innocent children. But remember that protecting yourself from your sister's manipulation also protects Emma and Ethan from learning that property theft and family manipulation are acceptable behaviors." The letter reminded me that my decision to establish boundaries had consequences beyond my immediate family relationships. but it also reinforced my understanding that healthy boundaries were necessary for modeling respect and appropriate behavior for the next generation. My work helping other families protect themselves from manipulation had given meaning and purpose to my traumatic experience. Each family we helped avoid property theft or financial abuse represented validation of my decision to fight back rather than comply with criminal demands disguised as family loyalty. The business was successful both financially and professionally, providing income that enhanced my security and work that utilized my unique experience for positive impact. But most importantly, it had transformed my victimization into expertise that protected other people from similar harm. Helping others had become the most satisfying aspect of my recovery from family betrayal, proof that surviving manipulation and maintaining boundaries could create opportunities to prevent similar harm to other families. 3 years after the family crisis began, I was sitting in my home office preparing for a legal consultation when I received an unexpected phone call from Detective Maria Santos, the federal investigator who had handled Harold Brennan's prosecution. Ms. Walsh, I wanted to update you on some developments in the Brennan case that I think you'll find interesting. His trial concluded last week, and he was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for operating a criminal enterprise that targeted families for property manipulation. The news was deeply satisfying. Brennan's conviction on 23 counts of wire fraud, elder abuse, and racketeering meant that his family property manipulation scheme had been permanently shut down, and he would be unable to target other families for over a decade. The judge specifically mentioned your case during sentencing, Detective Santos continued. She said your courage in fighting back and exposing the scheme had prevented dozens of other families from losing their homes to similar manipulation. But the most meaningful update involved the other families who had been victimized by Brennan's operation. Recovery of assets seized from his real estate investment partnerships had allowed restitution payments to families who had lost property through his manipulation schemes. Ms. Walsh, your willingness to go public with your story helped us identify other victims who were too embarrassed or intimidated to report their experiences. 12 families have recovered property or received financial compensation for their losses. The restitution represented more than just financial recovery for the families. It was validation that their experiences had been criminal victimization rather than family disputes, and proof that fighting back against family manipulation could lead to justice and accountability. My own financial situation had improved dramatically over the 3 years since the crisis began. The consulting business with Grace had generated substantial income. My corporate promotion had increased my salary significantly, and the speaking fees from conferences and training seminars had created additional revenue streams. More importantly, my housing costs had remained stable, while my income increased, providing financial security that allowed me to make choices based on personal preference rather than economic necessity. The house my family had tried to steal was now completely paid off, representing both financial independence and emotional victory over their manipulation attempts. But perhaps the most significant change was in my perspective on family relationships and personal boundaries. Working with dozens of families facing manipulation and abuse had taught me that biological relationships didn't automatically justify tolerance of harmful behavior, and that protecting yourself from toxic family members was often necessary for building healthy connections with other people. My romantic relationship with David Thompson had evolved into a partnership based on mutual respect and support for each other's boundary decisions. David's own experience with family financial manipulation had given him insight into the complexity of loving family members while protecting yourself from their harmful choices. Joanne, what you survived and how you responded shows incredible strength and wisdom. David said during a recent conversation about family relationships, "You chose your own well-being over family manipulation, and you used your experience to help other people avoid similar harm. That's exactly the kind of person I want to build a future with." Our relationship was being built on shared values about respect, boundaries, and mutual support, rather than obligation or family pressure. The contrast with my family's conditional love, based on compliance with their demands, was striking and healing. My professional life had also been transformed by the experience. The expertise I had gained in recognizing and resisting family manipulation had become a specialized skill set that provided both career advancement and meaningful work helping other people protect themselves from similar abuse. The consulting business had expanded to include training programs for law enforcement officers, social workers, and financial advisors who needed to recognize family financial abuse patterns. My experience had become the foundation for professional knowledge that helped protect other people from manipulation schemes. But the most unexpected development was a letter I received from Sarah on the 3rd anniversary of the day she had been evicted from my house. The letter was different in tone from her previous communication attempts, focusing on accountability rather than requests for reconciliation. Joanne, I've been participating in counseling programs as part of my probation requirements, and I'm beginning to understand the full scope of what I participated in when I tried to take your house. I want you to know that I recognize my actions were criminal, not misguided family assistance, and I don't expect or deserve forgiveness for the harm I caused. I also want you to know that Emma and Ethan are doing well. We've been living in a small apartment that I pay for with my own income from legitimate work. The children have learned that taking other people's property is wrong, regardless of family relationships, and they understand that actions have consequences that can't be undone through apologies. I don't expect you to respond to this letter or to change your decision about maintaining boundaries with our family. I just wanted you to know that your refusal to accept our manipulation taught all of us important lessons about respect and appropriate behavior. I hope your life continues to be successful and fulfilling. The letter represented genuine accountability rather than manipulation designed to reestablish contact. Sarah had apparently learned to distinguish between real remorse and strategic apology, understanding that accountability didn't require or deserve forgiveness from the people who had been harmed. I didn't respond to the letter, but I did share it with Dr. Chen during therapy as an example of how boundary maintenance could sometimes lead to positive changes in the people whose behavior necessitated those boundaries. Miss Walsh, sometimes protecting yourself from harmful family members creates consequences that motivate them to address their own behavior, Dr. Chen explained. Your sister's letter suggests that losing access to you and facing criminal consequences for her actions helped her understand the severity of what she had done. The letter also indicated that Emma and Ethan were learning appropriate values about property rights and family relationships. Sarah's decision to teach them that taking other people's possessions was wrong represented protection for their moral development that my compliance with the property theft would never have provided. 5 years after the family crisis began, I hosted my first Thanksgiving dinner in my own home since the attempted property theft. The guest list included David Grace Martinez and her family, Dr. Chen, and her partner, several colleagues from work, and 3 families I had helped protect from property manipulation schemes. The dinner represented my chosen family people who had supported my boundary decisions and respected my right to protect myself from harmful relationships. The conversation was warm and genuine, based on mutual care rather than obligation or manipulation. As I looked around my dining room filled with people who understood that love required respect for individual rights and boundaries, I felt complete satisfaction with the choices I had made during the family crisis. Fighting back against property theft had cost me my relationships with my parents and sister, but it had also protected my rights, exposed a criminal operation, and created opportunities to help other people avoid similar harm. My house remained mine, representing both financial security and emotional victory over family manipulation. My career had been strengthened rather than damaged by my experience with harassment and boundary setting. My relationships were healthier and more genuine than they had been before I learned to distinguish between love and manipulation. The trauma of family betrayal had been transformed into expertise that helped other people protect themselves from similar abuse. The isolation created by boundary maintenance had been replaced by connections with people who shared values about respect and appropriate treatment. Most importantly, I had learned that protecting yourself from family manipulation wasn't selfish or cruel. It was necessary for building authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation disguised as love. As I served dinner to my chosen family in the house my biological family had tried to steal, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't defeating their property theft scheme. It was discovering that my worth wasn't determined by my willingness to sacrifice for other people's benefit, and that genuine love didn't require tolerance of harmful behavior regardless of family relationships. Before we began eating, Grace raised her glass in a toast that perfectly captured the journey from victimization to empowerment. To Joanne, who showed us that protecting yourself from family manipulation isn't about holding grudges. It's about refusing to let other people's poor choices become your responsibility. The evening ended with planning for our next collaboration, a training program for family court judges about recognizing property manipulation schemes and protecting victims from relatives who weaponize family loyalty for personal gain. 3 years after my family tried to steal my house and destroy my career, my life was more successful, secure, and fulfilling than it had ever been. The price had been relationships with people who valued my compliance more than my well-being, but the reward was freedom to build connections based on genuine care and mutual respect. Looking back, I wouldn't change any of the decisions I had made during the crisis. Fighting back against family manipulation had been the right choice, both for protecting myself and for helping other families recognize that biological relationships didn't justify tolerance of criminal behavior. The house was mine, the career was stronger, the relationships were healthier, and the future was built on foundation of self-respect rather than family obligation. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to enable their worst impulses, even when that refusal comes with permanent consequences for the relationships. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that choosing yourself wasn't selfish when others were trying to exploit your loyalty for their benefit. Protecting your rights and boundaries wasn't cruel when others were using family connections to justify harmful behavior. And building a life based on respect rather than obligation wasn't cold when the alternative was accepting manipulation disguised as love. As I closed the door on my chosen family gathering that evening, I felt grateful for every choice I had made during the family crisis, even the painful ones, because those choices had led to a life where my worth wasn't determined by my willingness to sacrifice for other people's poor decisions, and where my home truly belonged to me. Have you ever faced pressure from family members who believe their needs should take priority over your rights? How do you think families should balance individual autonomy with collective responsibility? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help other people find it. Subscribe for more stories about standing up for yourself in difficult family situations, and share this with anyone who might be facing similar manipulation disguised as family loyalty. Thank you for listening to this difficult story, and remember that protecting yourself from harmful family dynamics isn't selfish. It's necessary for building authentic relationships based on respect rather than exploitation. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.